In June 1944, while Allied forces fought through hedgerows in Normandy, another front ignited farther east with an intensity measured not in headlines, but in artillery barrels. Operation Bagration began on June 22, timed deliberately 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army assembled over 2 million soldiers, supported by more than 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 5,000 aircraft. Artillery pieces numbering in the tens of thousands were positioned along a front stretching hundreds of miles. Ammunition stockpiles were calculated in millions of shells. Fuel reserves were measured in hundreds of thousands of tons to sustain continuous advance. Opposing them, Germany's Army Group Center held defensive lines across Belarus with approximately 800,000 men, though effective combat strength had eroded through attrition. Divisions were under strength. Panzer formations lacked full complements of vehicles. Supply routes depended on rail lines vulnerable to partisan sabotage and air attack. Defensive belts were thinner than Soviet intelligence estimated, but they lacked the depth required to absorb multi-directional assault. When the offensive opened, Soviet artillery fired in concentrations that fractured frontline positions within hours. Shells weighing over 15 pounds rained down in sustained barrages measured in thousands per sector. German communication lines snapped. Command posts were struck. Units reported casualties rising beyond 30% before coordinated counteraction could form. In the north near Vitebsk, Soviet forces encircled entire corps. In the south near Bobruisk, mechanized formations advanced through breaches, cutting retreat routes. German units attempted withdrawal, but roads clogged with vehicles weighing several tons each, ammunition wagons, and infantry columns. Air attacks struck convoys, igniting fuel trucks carrying thousands of gallons of gasoline. Inside a German field headquarters, as artillery detonated nearby, maps trembled on tables. Telephone operators shouted into receivers that carried only static. Orders to hold positions collided with realities of encirclement. Soldiers on the ground felt earth shake under continuous bombardment, ears ringing, vision blurred by dust and smoke. Soviet operational design emphasized simultaneous pressure along multiple axes. Tank armies advanced beyond initial breakthrough lines, penetrating dozens of miles in days. A T-34 tank, weighing roughly 30 tons, required fuel measured in hundreds of gallons over extended movement. Supply echelons followed closely, bridging rivers and repairing rail lines to maintain tempo. When I once examined German daily strength reports from Army Group Center in late June and compared them with Soviet breakthrough timelines, the collapse revealed itself as a sequence rather than a single rupture. Divisions ceased reporting not because they were formally dissolved, but because they were encircled and destroyed piecemeal. In certain formations, casualty and capture rates exceeded 60% within weeks. Cities such as Minsk fell as Soviet forces converged from multiple directions. By early July, entire German corps had been annihilated or captured. The offensive did not stall at initial objectives. It continued westward, covering hundreds of miles in 5 weeks. Rail hubs, depots, and defensive nodes eroded under sustained assault. Germany attempted to stabilize the front by transferring units from other sectors, but logistical capacity strained. Replacement equipment could not match the rate of loss. Tanks destroyed in Belarus required steel and labor that German industry, under bombardment, struggled to provide. Fuel shortages compounded mobility issues. Operation Bagration did not merely push back lines. It dismantled Army Group Center as an effective fighting force. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist as coherent formations. The Eastern Front shifted irreversibly westward. For the soldiers advancing through Belarus, progress meant river crossings under fire, tank tracks grinding over shattered roads, and the metallic scent of artillery smoke hanging over forests. For those retreating or encircled, it meant dwindling ammunition boxes, rations counted by the day, and radio messages that never received reply. If you are listening now, perhaps with night settling quietly around you, imagine a long column moving westward through forests. Engines steady, artillery distant but constant. Then imagine the sound fading as the column passes beyond earshot, leaving only wind through trees. The advance does not hurry. It presses forward, mile after mile, until resistance thins. This is the entire history of Operation Bagration. Chapter 1. The Ghost of a Georgian Prince. The 20th of May, 1944, Moscow. Somewhere inside the Kremlin complex, in one of those windowless conference rooms where the Soviet High Command decided the fates of millions, a typed operational directive is circulating among a handful of men who will not leave the building until a decision is reached. The document outlines an offensive of staggering ambition, the destruction of an entire German army group across a frontage roughly the size of the United Kingdom. But what catches the eye, if you're the kind of researcher who reads margins instead of titles, isn't the force allocations or the phase lines or the ambitious timetable. It's a pencil annotation. Archivists have debated the handwriting for decades, with some attributing it to General Alexei Antonov, the Stavka's chief operations officer, has written a date beside the proposed launch window and circled it. Twice. The date is the 22nd of June, 3 years to the day since the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border and nearly destroyed the country. The circularity isn't poetic, it's deliberate. And if you understand that deliberateness, you understand everything that follows. The code name typed at the top of the directive is Bagration. Not a geographic feature, not a weather system, not one of those antiseptic labels that military bureaucracies prefer. A name, a human name. Prince Pyotr Bagration, born around 1765 in the Caucasus, a Georgian nobleman who rose through the ranks of the Imperial Russian Army to become one of its most celebrated commanders during the Napoleonic Wars. He fought at Austerlitz, he fought at Eylau, and on the 7th of September 1812 at Borodino, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, he commanded the left wing of the Russian defensive line and was struck by shell fragments that shattered his leg. He refused evacuation for as long as he could stand. He died 17 days later. The connection between the prince and the offensive is not subtle. Napoleon invaded Russia. Bagration died fighting him. Hitler invaded Russia. And now the Soviet Union would destroy Hitler's army under the dead prince's name. Stalin personally selected the codename, according to Colonel General Sergei Shtemenko of the Stavka Operations Directorate, though Marshal Zhukov's memoirs suggest it emerged more collectively. I note the disagreement, not because it matters militarily, it doesn't, but because it tells you something about the post-war credit wars among Soviet marshals, where even the naming of an operation became contested ground. There is a deeper layer to the naming that most accounts pass over quickly, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Bagration was Georgian. Stalin was Georgian. In 1944, the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic empire fighting an existential war, and Stalin had spent 2 decades suppressing national identities in favor of a unified Soviet consciousness. Yet here he was, reaching back 132 years to claim a Georgian prince, a man of royal blood, no less, a category of person the Soviet state had theoretically abolished, as the symbolic patron of its greatest offensive. The message wasn't aimed at the Germans. They wouldn't learn the codename until much later. The message was internal, and it was layered. To the Russian military establishment, the name said, "This offensive stands in the tradition of the great patriotic wars against European invaders." To the Georgian population, it said, "Your greatest sons belong to us." To history, it said, "We remember. We don't forget dates, and we don't forget names." The 22nd of June would be answered with the 22nd of June, and the answer would be total. To understand what Bagration was designed to destroy, you have to understand what Army Group Center looked like in the spring of 1944. And the picture is more complicated than the phrase overextended and undermanned usually conveys. The Army Group held a massive eastward-facing bulge in Belorussia, which Soviet planners called the Belarus Balcony. From north to south, 4 German armies occupied the line. Generaloberst Georg Hans Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Army, Generaloberst Kurt von Tippelskirch's 4th Army, General Oberst Walter Weiss's Second Army, and General of Infantry Hans Jordan's Ninth Army. 38 divisions in total. On paper, that sounds formidable. In reality, it was a force hollowed out by 3 years of continuous warfare, chronic under-reinforcement, and the German High Command's conviction that the real danger lay not here, but further south, in Ukraine. The total strength of the 4 armies was approximately 500,000 men, a large number until you consider that they were defending a front of roughly 600 miles. That works out to 1 division per 16 miles of front. At Kursk the previous year, German defensive densities had been 1 division per 3 to 5 miles. Army Group Center wasn't a defensive line, it was a tripwire. The armor situation was worse than the infantry picture, and it tells you more about the strategic miscalculation that preceded Bagration than any single decision by any single commander. The 3rd Panzer Army, a formation whose very name implied armored striking power, possessed 0 operational panzer battalions. None. Not a single tank. It was a panzer army the way a bankrupt company is still listed on the stock exchange. The name persisted after the substance had been liquidated. Across all 4 armies, Army Group Center fielded approximately 120 operational panzers and around 450 self-propelled assault guns. The Soviet forces massing opposite them had 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns. I want to sit with that ratio for a moment, because raw numbers can numb you into indifference if you encounter them too quickly. In certain breakthrough sectors, the Soviet advantage wouldn't be 4-1 or even 10-1. It would approach mathematical infinity, Soviet armor attacking sectors defended by infantry with no armor at all. The reason for this disparity was not incompetence at the army group level. It was a strategic choice made at the highest levels of the German command. The Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command, and Hitler himself were convinced that the next major Soviet offensive would strike in Ukraine, south of the Pripyat marshes. To meet that expected blow, the overwhelming majority of German panzer formations on the entire Eastern Front had been concentrated in Army Group North Ukraine sector. Army Group Center had been stripped to feed a defense that was being built in the wrong place. General Feldmarschall Ernst Busch, the man commanding Army Group Center, has been treated harshly by history, and I've gone back and forth on whether that harshness is entirely fair. He was not a brilliant commander. No one has ever claimed he was. His appointment owed more to his reputation for obedience than to any demonstrated operational genius. But on the 20th of May, 1944, Busch did something that complicates the portrait of a simple yes man. He flew to the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, and presented 2 withdrawal proposals. The first plan called for a minor pullback to the Dnieper River. The second, more ambitious, called for a withdrawal all the way to the Berezina River, which would have shortened the front line dramatically and freed up divisions to create an operational reserve. Either plan would have given Army Group Center a fighting chance. When I was reading through the accounts of this meeting, what struck me was not that Hitler rejected both proposals, that was predictable, but that Busch apparently presented them clearly, argued for them, and then, upon rejection, saluted and returned to his headquarters without further protest. He had the right answer, he carried it into the room, and then he accepted the wrong one. I cannot decide whether that makes him culpable for what followed or simply human in a system that had made independent judgment suicidal. Hitler's rejection wasn't arbitrary, or at least it didn't feel arbitrary within the logic of his own strategic framework. He had been demanding since 1941 that not an inch of conquered territory be surrendered without a fight, and by early 1944, this obsession had been codified into formal doctrine. Führer Order No. 11, issued on the 8th of March 1944, established the concept of the Feste Platz, the fortified place. Key cities and transportation nodes were to be designated as fortresses, garrisoned and held to the last man, regardless of the tactical situation. The purpose, according to the order itself, was to ensure that the enemy does not occupy these areas of decisive operational importance and to allow themselves to be surrounded, thereby holding down the largest possible number of enemy forces. In Army Group Center sector, 8 locations received the Feste Platz designation: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Baranovichi, Minsk, Bobruisk, Slutsk, and Vilnius. Each one was now an anchor that could not be abandoned. Each one was, by the logic of events about to unfold, a trap. Opposing this stretched, armor-stripped, doctrinally frozen army group, the Soviet Union had assembled a force of extraordinary power. 4 army fronts: the First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration, the Third Belarusian Front under Colonel General Ivan Chernyakovsky, the Second Belarusian Front under General Grigory Zakharov, and the First Belarusian Front under Colonel General Konstantin Rokossovsky, together mustered 1,670,000 men, 33,000 guns and mortars, the 5,800 tanks already mentioned, and 5,300 combat aircraft from 5 air armies. Behind the German lines, 140,000 partisans operated under direct radio control from Moscow, waiting for the signal to begin cutting rail lines. The Soviet plan called for 2 phases. First, rupture the German defensive line along the eastern face of the Belarusian Bulge through simultaneous attacks on Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk, the very Feste Plätze that Hitler had ordered held to the last man. Second, exploit the breakthroughs to encircle and destroy the remnants of Army Group Center west of Minsk. The intent was explicit and openly stated in Soviet planning documents: to do to the Germans exactly what the Germans had done to the Red Army in the summer of 1941. The cauldron battles of Barbarossa, Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev had consumed millions of Soviet soldiers. Now the debt would be collected. The Stavka placed extraordinary emphasis on coordination between the 4 fronts, and the rank of the officers assigned to supervise that coordination tells you how seriously Moscow took the operation. Chief of the Soviet General Staff, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, was assigned to coordinate the First Baltic and Third Belarusian fronts. Deputy Supreme Commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most famous soldier in the Soviet Union, was given oversight of the First and Second Belarusian fronts. These were not advisory roles. Vasilevsky and Zhukov had the authority to intervene directly in front-level operations, to redirect divisions, to relieve commanders, and to alter timetables. Their presence was Stalin's insurance policy against the kind of interfront rivalries and communication failures that had plagued Soviet operations earlier in the war. The planning was meticulous, conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy, and it would be supported by what was perhaps the most sophisticated deception operation the Red Army had ever attempted. But that deception and its success belongs to the next chapter. The operation was ready by mid-May. It would launch on the 22nd of June. That date, circled twice in pencil on a directive in Moscow, would become the starting gun for the largest single military catastrophe in the history of the German army. Not Stalingrad, where the Sixth Army was destroyed over months of grinding attrition. Bagration would accomplish something faster and, in raw numbers, even more devastating: the annihilation of an entire army group in 5 weeks, across a front of 1,000 kilometers, producing German casualties that would ultimately range, depending on whose figures you trust, and that question itself is a battlefield, from 300,000 to over 500,000. The prince who died at Borodino in 1812 could not have imagined that his name would be written across the destruction of 300,000 men in the forests of Belarusia. But then, the people who chose his name weren't interested in what he could imagine. They were interested in what they could remember. And what they remembered was the 22nd of June, 1941. Everything that follows is the answer. Chapter 2. The Map That Lied. Late May, 1944. Zossen, roughly 30 kilometers south of Berlin. Buried beneath a complex of camouflage buildings known as Maybach II, the headquarters of the Oberkommando des Heers hummed with the bureaucratic rhythm of an organization trying to manage a war on multiple fronts with diminishing resources and increasing desperation. Somewhere in this labyrinth, in the offices of Foreign Armies East, Fremde Heere Ost, the intelligence directorate responsible for assessing Soviet capabilities and intentions, Situation maps were being updated with the latest reconnaissance and signals intelligence. These maps survive. You can find them in the Bundesarchiv Militär Archiv in Freiburg. And when I first examined reproductions of the late May editions, one detail stopped me cold. Soviet armored formations south of the Pripyat marshes, in the Ukrainian sector, opposite Army Group North Ukraine, were marked in heavy red wax pencil, bold and confident, demanding attention. Soviet formations opposite Army Group Center in Belarusia were noted in thinner, lighter markings, almost tentative, as if the cartographer himself wasn't entirely convinced they warranted the same weight. The visual hierarchy of those two colors told a story. It told the wrong story. And the man responsible for that story was Colonel Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen was not stupid. This is the first thing you have to understand about the intelligence failure that preceded Bagration, because there is a powerful temptation to explain catastrophic misjudgment as simple incompetence, and the temptation is wrong. Gehlen had built Fremde Heer Ost into one of the more capable military intelligence organizations of the war. His analysts tracked Soviet order of battle with a diligence that was, within limits, impressive. They monitored radio traffic, debriefed prisoners, analyzed aerial photography, and maintained running estimates of Soviet strength that were, more often than not, within reasonable margins of the actual figures. The problem was not data collection. The problem was interpretation. Gehlen had concluded, and his weekly intelligence summaries from this period state it with considerable confidence, that the next major Soviet offensive would strike in Ukraine, aimed at Army Group North Ukraine and the vital Romanian oil fields beyond. Soviet activity in Belarusia was acknowledged but classified as secondary, diversionary, or preparatory for a later, smaller operation. It was precisely the kind of assessment that made sense if you started from a certain set of assumptions and then filtered incoming information through them. It was also catastrophically wrong. The Soviet deception operation that fed Gehlen's error was, I think, one of the most underappreciated military achievements of the entire war. The Russians called it Maskirovka, a term that translates roughly as masking or disguise, but whose operational meaning was far broader than either word suggests. For Bagration, Maskirovka operated at every level simultaneously. At the strategic level, the First Ukrainian Front, which was not part of the Bagration offensive, conducted an elaborate program of false radio traffic, simulating the kind of intense signal activity that would precede a major offensive in their sector. They assembled dummy tank parks using inflatable vehicles and wooden mock-ups, positioned where German aerial reconnaissance could find them. They moved real units conspicuously during daylight hours, creating the impression of a massive buildup opposite Army Group North Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Belarusia, the actual buildup for Bagration proceeded under conditions of extraordinary discipline. All troop movements were conducted at night. Units observed strict radio silence. Frontline Red Army formations made a deliberate show of constructing defensive positions, digging trenches, laying wire, doing everything that an army preparing to absorb an attack, rather than launch one, would do. Staff officers overflew their own positions in daylight to verify that camouflage discipline was being maintained. Civilian populations were evacuated from forward zones, not primarily for humanitarian reasons, though Soviet accounts later framed it that way, but to eliminate any chance of information leaking to the Germans through human contact. I find myself wanting to be fair to Gehlen here, and I keep bumping up against the limits of that fairness. Some of the Soviet deception was genuinely brilliant, not clever in a textbook sense, but operationally brilliant, executed with a discipline and consistency that would have fooled intelligence services far more capable than Fremde Heer Ost. The dummy tank parks alone were impressive. Soviet engineers had become expert at producing fake armored vehicles that looked convincing from reconnaissance altitude, complete with fake track marks in the mud and simulated engine heat signatures created by small fires lit beneath the hulls. The false radio traffic from the First Ukrainian Front was carefully calibrated to mimic real pre-offensive communications patterns, including the characteristic increase in logistical traffic that preceded any major Soviet operation. If you were sitting in Zossen, monitoring these signals, and you already believed the main blow was coming in Ukraine, the deception traffic would have confirmed your belief with what appeared to be hard signals intelligence. This is the cruelest trick of confirmation bias. The false evidence feels more convincing than the real evidence because it arrives in the shape your expectations have already prepared for it. But here's where my sympathy for Galen begins to fracture. By early June 1944, German Army Group Center's own intelligence section, the people on the ground, closer to the front, responsible for the sector that was actually about to be attacked, had begun filing reports that contradicted Galen's assessment. Ground reconnaissance, interrogation of captured Soviet soldiers, and the pattern of Soviet air activity all pointed to something big building in Belarusia. When Soviet long-range aviation began sustained attacks on German airfields starting on the 12th of June, the signals were no longer ambiguous. They were alarms. Army Group Center's intelligence officers passed these warnings up the chain. The warnings reached Zossen, and Galen's section weighed them against the evidence from Ukraine, the false evidence, the deception traffic, the dummy tanks, and concluded that the Belarusian indicators were secondary. The machine worked exactly as designed. It collected the correct data, routed it to the correct desk, and the correct desk filed it under diversionary activity. When I cross-referenced the Army Group Center intelligence reports from early June with Galen's contemporaneous assessments, the dissonance was physically uncomfortable to read. It's like watching someone ignore a fire alarm because they've decided the real danger is a flood. There is a recent piece of scholarship published through Taylor and Francis in early 2025 that raises an even more provocative possibility. The article hypothesizes that Soviet strategic intelligence may have actively participated in the Maskirovka campaign by feeding false information through channels they knew Galen's organization monitored. If this is confirmed by further archival research, and the evidence at this point is suggestive rather than conclusive, it would mean that Bagration's deception was not merely a military operation supporting a military offensive. It would mean it was a coordinated intelligence and military operation, with the Soviet espionage apparatus and the Soviet General Staff working in deliberate concert to construct a false picture of reality and deliver it to the specific desk where it would do the most damage. I mention this not as established fact, it isn't yet, but because it illustrates how the historiography of Bagration continues to evolve, and how the intelligence dimension of the operation may be even more sophisticated than the already impressive picture we currently have. The practical consequence of Galen's assessment was the force allocation decision that effectively doomed Army Group Center before the first shot was fired. Because OKH believed the main Soviet effort would come in Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of German panzer divisions on the Eastern Front were positioned in Army Group North Ukraine sector, south of the Pripyat marshes. The logic was straightforward. You put your mobile reserves where you expect the enemy's main effort. The problem was that the expected main effort was a fiction. In Belarusia, the 3rd Panzer Army had no tanks at all. The entire army group had roughly 120 operational panzers and 450 assault guns to cover 600 miles of front. To put that in perspective, a single Soviet tank corps contained more armor than the entire 3rd Panzer Army. The Soviet 4 fronts assigned to Bagration collectively fielded 5,800 armored vehicles. In the breakthrough sectors, the narrow zones where Soviet forces would concentrate for the initial assault, the ratio of Soviet to German armor would not be merely lopsided. In some sectors, it would be armor against nothing, tanks against riflemen. The map in Zossen said the armor was in the wrong place. The map was lying. And the map won the argument. Bush himself seems to have oscillated between trust in OKH's assessment and growing unease at what his own intelligence people were telling him. The evidence suggests he took the Soviet threat seriously enough to present his withdrawal proposals to Hitler on the 20th of May, which implies he understood the vulnerability of his position. But he did not press the point when the proposals were rejected, and as June progressed and the warning signs multiplied, he did not take the dramatic step of requesting emergency reinforcement or threatening resignation if it was denied. On the 19th of June, 3 days before the offensive would begin, Bush flew to Germany on leave. The commander of an army group that his own intelligence section believed was about to be attacked flew home. I've read multiple explanations for this decision, ranging from the charitable, he was physically exhausted and had been assured by OKH that the threat was manageable, to the damning, he had abdicated responsibility because the system no longer permitted him to exercise it. The truth probably contains elements of both. What is beyond dispute is that when the blow fell on the 22nd of June, Bush was not at his headquarters. He was in Germany. He learned of the offensive by telephone. The Luftwaffe's contribution to the intelligence failure deserves a paragraph of its own because it illustrates how Soviet air superiority, achieved gradually, painfully, over 3 years of air combat, created the conditions for the deception to work. By mid-1944, German aerial reconnaissance over Belarusia was becoming increasingly difficult. Soviet fighters intercepted German reconnaissance aircraft with growing frequency and effectiveness, creating gaps in photographic coverage precisely in the sectors where the Soviet buildup was densest. Luftflotte 6, the air fleet supporting Army Group Center, was itself dramatically under strength. 775 aircraft against the Soviet air armada of 5,300. German reconnaissance pilots who did manage to photograph Soviet rear areas reported increased activity, but the photographs were often incomplete, covering some areas and missing others. The missing areas were, of course, where the Soviets had concentrated their most sensitive preparations. The aerial intelligence picture that reached Galen's desk was not wrong in what it showed. It was catastrophically incomplete in what it didn't show. And Galen, working from an incomplete picture, filled in the blanks with his expectations rather than his doubts. The deception held. All the way through May, through June, through the partisan attacks on the night of the 19th, through the opening artillery barrages on the 22nd, the deception held. The German High Command remained convinced, even after Bagration had begun, that the Belarusian offensive was a diversion and that the real blow was still coming in Ukraine. Panzer reserves were not released to Army Group Center for days after the offensive started. When they finally were released, they arrived piecemeal, too few and too late. The battle that destroyed Army Group Center was decided in the intelligence estimates of late May, written in thin blue pencil on a map in a bunker near Berlin. The map said the danger was in the south. The map was wrong, and by the time anyone in Zossen understood how wrong it was, 38 divisions were already inside the trap that the map had helped to build. The red wax pencil pointing south had drawn the eyes of the German High Command away from the place where 1,670,000 Soviet soldiers, 33,000 guns, and 5,800 tanks were waiting in silence, in darkness, under camouflage nets and forest canopy, for the 22nd of June. Chapter 3, 140,000 Ghosts. The night of the 19th of June, 1944. Somewhere in the forests of Brest Oblast, in the western reaches of occupied Belarusia, a partisan radio operator is receiving final confirmation of an order that has been months in preparation. The message is terse. Soviet military communications didn't waste words or battery power on eloquence. The content is an execution order, not for a person, but for a transportation network. Across the German rear area in Belarusia, from the rail junctions near Minsk to the secondary lines feeding the front, 140,000 partisans are receiving the same signal. The targets are specific: rail lines, bridges, switching points, signal equipment. The timing is coordinated. The attacks are to begin tonight, 3 days before the main offensive, to ensure that when the blow falls on the 22nd, the German army will be unable to move its reserves by rail. In the archives of the Belarusian staff of the partisan movement, held in the National Archives of the Republic of Belarus in Minsk, the telegrams from that night survive as a staccato record of detonations. Sector 14, rail cut. Sector 22, bridge blown. Sector 9, rail cut, 2 casualties. The handwriting in the logbook deteriorates as the night progresses. The radio operator was writing faster than he could process, recording explosions in real time. The scale of what happened on the night of the 19th and into the 20th of June is difficult to convey without resorting to numbers that sound implausible. Soviet records claim over 10,500 separate demolitions of rail sections across the German rear area in a single night. If that figure is even approximately accurate, and German logistics records, while fragmentary, confirm widespread disruption, it represents one of the largest coordinated sabotage operations in military history. A standard German field railway repair unit could restore approximately 1 kilometer of damaged track per day under favorable conditions. The partisans had, in the space of a few hours, created repair backlogs measured in weeks. In some locations, all rail traffic simply ceased. Trains loaded with ammunition, replacement troops, and supplies sat motionless on sidings, unable to move forward to the units that needed them and unable to retreat to safety. 3 days before the first Soviet artillery shell landed on a German trench, the logistics system that sustained Army Group Center was already hemorrhaging. But I need to be careful here, because the Partisan Rail War has been mythologized to the point where the mythology has started to obscure the more complicated truth. Soviet-era historiography presented the partisan attacks as universally devastating and precisely coordinated, a seamless expression of the people's war waged by heroic citizens against the fascist invader. The reality, as it usually is, was messier. German rear area records indicate that some rail lines were repaired within hours. Others remained cut for days. The operational impact varied enormously depending on the specific location, the availability of repair materials, and the proximity of German security forces. Some historians have argued, and it's an argument worth taking seriously, that the partisan rail attacks were more psychologically disruptive than they were logistically decisive. They created a climate of chaos and insecurity in the German rear that compounded the effects of the Soviet conventional offensive, but did not by themselves prevent the movement of major German formations. Others point to specific, documented instances where reinforcement movements were delayed by days because of rail cuts, delays that had measurable consequences when those reinforcements failed to arrive at critical sectors in time. The truth sits somewhere in the middle, and it probably varies by sector, a frustrating answer for anyone who wants a clean verdict, but an honest one. What gets lost in the operational debate is the human substrate of the partisan movement itself. The 3 years of suffering, survival, and moral compromise that preceded the night of the 19th. The 140,000 partisans who cut rail lines that night didn't materialize out of the forests, fully armed and organized. They were the survivors of an occupation that had killed approximately 1/4 of the Belarusian population. 1 in 4. The German occupation of Belarusia was among the most brutal in the entire war. A campaign of systematic destruction that targeted Jews, suspected partisans, and frequently entire villages with no distinction between combatants and civilians. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, had swept through in 1941 and 42. Anti-partisan operations, conducted under the euphemistic doctrine of Bandenbekämpfung, burned villages and executed their inhabitants on the presumption that any community near a forest might harbor resistance. The partisans drew their numbers from a population that had already been decimated, and the people who joined them did so not because they had read communist theory, but because every other option had been eliminated. I should be transparent about something that makes me uncomfortable, because I think intellectual honesty matters more than narrative convenience when you're dealing with this subject. The partisan movement in Belarusia was not purely a spontaneous expression of popular resistance. It was, by 1944, a centrally controlled military organization operating under direct orders from Moscow via the central staff of the partisan movement. NKVD officers were parachuted into the forests to impose discipline, coordinate operations, and enforce political loyalty. The relationship between the partisans and the Soviet state was not one of equals. It was one of command and obedience, backed by the implicit threat that partisans who deviated from orders or who demonstrated insufficient political reliability could be dealt with by the same NKVD apparatus that had conducted the purges of the 1930s. The heroism was real. The NKVD officer standing behind the heroism was also real. Acknowledging both simultaneously is what separates history from propaganda, and it's a separation I intend to maintain throughout this documentary. The logistics of partisan warfare in Belarusian conditions deserve a closer look, because the romanticized image of the forest fighter, resourceful, self-sufficient, living off the land, obscures the grinding reality of material scarcity. Explosives were chronically in short supply. Many partisan units relied on captured German ordnance, mines, grenades, demolition charges salvaged from abandoned positions, or taken in raids on supply depots. Others received airdrops from Soviet aircraft, but these deliveries were irregular, dangerous. Soviet transport planes flying over occupied territory at night faced both German flak and the challenge of locating small forest clearings in darkness, and insufficient to meet demand. The preferred method of rail demolition was not simply cutting a rail. A single rail break could be repaired relatively quickly by a German repair crew. The most effective technique targeted rail joints, the points where two sections of rail met over a sleeper. Destroying a joint warped the underlying timber structure and required complete replacement rather than patching, a significantly more time-consuming repair. Partisans who understood this distinction maximized the impact of their limited explosives. Those who didn't wasted scarce charges on cuts that were repaired within hours. The difference between effective and ineffective sabotage was, at its root, a question of technical knowledge transmitted under impossible conditions. There is a dimension of the partisan story that Soviet-era accounts systematically suppressed, and that I think deserves explicit acknowledgement. A significant number of Belarusian partisans, impossible to quantify precisely, but documented in multiple post-war testimonies and historical studies, were Jewish survivors of the ghettos, massacres, and extermination campaigns of 1941 and 42. For these men and women, the partisan war was not a new fight, but a continuation of a struggle for survival that had begun when the Einsatzgruppen arrived. Family groups, including the famous Bielski partisans, though they operated in a different sector, had fled into the forests to escape liquidation and gradually organized into fighting units or attached themselves to existing Soviet partisan brigades. Their presence was complicated. They faced anti-Semitism within some partisan units. They were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, and their specific identity as Jewish survivors was subsumed in Soviet accounts under the collective label Soviet people. The rail cuts of the 19th of June were carried out by people whose individual motivations ranged from patriotic duty to ideological commitment to the raw, animal drive to survive in a landscape designed for their extinction. Reducing that diversity of experience to a single heroic narrative does violence to their memory. The German response to the partisan attacks was immediate but insufficient. Rear area security divisions, typically composed of older soldiers, second-line equipment, and limited mobility, were deployed to protect the most critical rail junctions and begin repair operations. But the scale of the damage overwhelmed their capacity. German security forces in the rear areas of Army Group Center numbered in the tens of thousands, but they were spread thin across an enormous territory, and the simultaneous nature of the partisan attacks meant they could not concentrate at any single point without leaving others undefended. Some repair crews worked through the night and into the next day under partisan sniper fire. Others were ambushed en route to repair sites. The cumulative effect was not the complete paralysis of the German rail network. That would be an overstatement, but a degradation significant enough that certain reinforcement movements were delayed by hours to days, a margin that would matter enormously when the main offensive began 72 hours later. As the night wore on and the detonation reports accumulated in the partisan radio logs, something was happening in the forests that the telegrams didn't capture and that the operational summaries would never record: the cost. Partisan casualties during the rail war are poorly documented. Soviet records focused on demolitions achieved rather than personnel lost, and many partisan units kept incomplete roles. What we know is that the German rear area forces did not passively absorb the attacks. They fought back. Security patrols engaged partisan demolition teams. Minefields around key rail installations took their toll. Some partisan groups were intercepted before they reached their targets and destroyed. The 2 casualties noted in that early telegram from Sector 9, a passing mention in a night of thousands of explosions, represent a human cost that scales upward into the thousands when you multiply it across the entire operational area. These were people who had survived 3 years of the most lethal occupation in European history, only to be killed on the night their survival was finally supposed to mean something. By dawn on the 20th of June, the rail network behind Army Group Center was wounded. Not dead, the Germans were too competent at field repair for that, but wounded in a way that would bleed capacity for days. The main Soviet offensive was still 2 days away. The partisans had delivered the invisible first blow of Operation Bagration, a blow that left no craters visible from the air, no burning cities, no columns of smoke, just silence on rail lines that should have been carrying trains, and the growing pile of reports on the desks of German logistics officers describing delays, disruptions, and repair estimates that stretched past the horizon. 140,000 people, most of them hungry, many of them grieving, some of them fighting for a country that would never fully acknowledge them, had reached out in the darkness and severed the tendons of an army. The forests of Belarusia returned to silence. In 72 hours, the silence would end. Chapter 4. The Concrete Coffin. Hitler's Feste Plätze. The 8th of March, 1944. 3.5 months before the first Soviet shell of Bagration lands on a German trench. On this date, a directive is issued from the Wolfschanze, Hitler's field headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, that will, in hindsight, do more to destroy Army Group Center than any Soviet battle plan. It is Führer Order Number 11, and it establishes the doctrine of the Feste Platz, the fortified place. The document survives in multiple copies across the Bundesarchive. Its key passage reads, in translation, roughly as follows. The fortified places will fulfill the function of fortresses in former times. They will ensure that the enemy does not occupy these areas of decisive operational importance. They will allow themselves to be surrounded, thereby holding down the largest possible number of enemy forces. The language is calm, bureaucratic, almost architectural in its confidence. It reads like a building code. In practice, it was a death warrant. And on at least one copy, held at a divisional headquarters according to archival notes, someone wrote a single word in the margin. Paleographers have debated the handwriting, but the consensus transcription is Wahnsinn, madness. I want to linger on this document because I believe it is the single most important piece of paper in the entire Bagration story, more important than any Soviet operational directive, more consequential than any intelligence assessment. Führer Order Number 11 didn't respond to Bagration. It preceded Bagration by 3.5 months. It was not a panicked reaction to a crisis. It was a premeditated doctrinal commitment issued during a period of relative stability on the central sector of the Eastern Front, based on a strategic philosophy that Hitler had been refining since Stalingrad. The conviction that holding ground was inherently more valuable than preserving forces. The order designated specific cities and towns as Feste Plätze that were to be held to the last man, regardless of the tactical situation, regardless of encirclement, regardless of the garrison commander's judgment about the viability of continued defense. In Army Group Center sector, 8 positions received this designation: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Baranovichi, Minsk, Bobruisk, Slutsk, and Vilnius. Each one was assigned a fortress commandant with explicit orders. Each one was now immovable. The theory behind the Feste Platz doctrine was not, on its surface, entirely insane, which is what makes it insidious. The idea was that a fortified garrison, even when surrounded, would force the attacker to divert significant forces to contain it, thereby weakening the attacker's main advance and buying time for the defender to organize a counterattack or establish a new defensive line. This had worked, after a fashion, at various points earlier in the war. Some encircled German positions had held long enough to be relieved. Others had tied down Soviet formations that might otherwise have been used in pursuit. Hitler's error was not in recognizing that fortified positions could serve a delaying function. His error was in believing that this function applied universally, regardless of the relative strength of the forces involved, the geographic situation, or the quality of the fortifications themselves. The Feste Plätze in Belarusia were not, for the most part, purpose-built fortresses. Vitebsk had some concrete bunkers dating from earlier phases of the war. Bobruisk relied primarily on earthworks. The gap between the doctrinal concept, the grand fortress, bristling with guns, tying down armies, and the physical reality of hastily dug trenches and improvised strongpoints was a gap large enough to swallow entire corps. The doctrine had already been tested and found catastrophically wanting before Bagration even began, and this is a point I feel strongly about because it speaks to one of the most disturbing patterns in the German command structure of this period: the institutional inability to learn from failure. In March and April of 1944, barely 2 months before Bagration, the Feste Platz at Tarnopol in Ukraine had been designated, garrisoned, surrounded, and destroyed. The pattern was precise. The garrison held as ordered. Soviet forces bypassed it. The garrison was systematically reduced, and relief forces proved unable to break through. The survivors were few. The tactical benefit to the German defense was negligible. The Soviet advance continued past Tarnopol without meaningful delay. This precedent was available to every German commander who cared to examine it. The after-action reports existed. The evidence was unambiguous. And yet, when Bagration began 3 months later, the Feste Platz garrisons at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk received identical orders: hold to the last man. No one, so far as the surviving records indicate, formally presented the Tarnopol precedent to Hitler as evidence that the doctrine was flawed. The system had stopped processing feedback. It was issuing orders based on ideology rather than observation, and the soldiers garrisoning those Feste Plätze would pay for that failure with their lives. I have spent more time than I'd care to admit reading the records surrounding Bush's 2 withdrawal proposals from the 20th of May, and the more I read, the more tragic the picture becomes. Bush understood the problem. His proposals, the minor withdrawal to the Dnieper River, the major withdrawal to the Berezina, were operationally sound. Either one would have shortened the front line, created reserves by freeing up divisions from sectors that no longer needed defending, and given Army Group Center the flexibility to respond to a Soviet offensive rather than simply absorbing it in place. Bush presented these proposals to Hitler in person. He argued for them. The details of the conversation don't survive in exact transcript form, but the gist is clear from post-war accounts. Hitler rejected both proposals, reiterated the Feste Platz doctrine, and ordered Army Group Center to hold its current positions. Bush saluted and returned to his headquarters. He did not resign. He did not request transfer. He did not go over Hitler's head to OKH. Not that OKH had the authority or the inclination to overrule the Führer on a matter of defensive doctrine. He accepted the decision and began implementing an operational plan that he had, by his own analysis, identified as untenable. It fascinates me, and I use fascinates in its original uncomfortable sense, meaning held in horrified attention. How a man can carry the correct answer into a room, hear it rejected, and walk out prepared to execute the incorrect one. The word for this is not incompetence. It might be cowardice. It might be institutionalized obedience. It might simply be what happens to human judgment inside a system that has made independent thought a form of treason. Army Group Center's defensive posture on the eve of Bagration was the physical expression of these doctrinal and command failures, and the numbers describe a force that was structurally incapable of achieving what it was being asked to do. 38 divisions held a front of approximately 600 miles, yielding an average density of roughly 1 division per 16 miles. To put that figure in context, the German defensive positions at Kursk in the summer of 1943, positions that were specifically designed to absorb and stop a massive Soviet offensive, achieved densities of 1 division per 3 to 5 miles. The Belarusian front was, by comparison, a membrane. In certain sectors, German units were spread so thin that the front line existed primarily on maps rather than on the ground. There were stretches where patrols from adjacent units could not physically reach each other, leaving gaps that were covered by nothing more than the assumption that the terrain was too difficult for the Soviets to traverse. This assumption, as the next chapter will demonstrate in the case of Bobruisk, was fatally wrong. The fortress commandants themselves were, in many cases, capable officers placed in positions that no amount of capability could salvage. At Vitebsk, the 53rd Corps under General Friedrich Gollwitzer was designated as the fortress garrison. Gollwitzer commanded approximately 30,000 men, a substantial force, but one that was about to be attacked by 2 Soviet army-level formations simultaneously while receiving no meaningful reinforcement. At Bobruisk, the situation was similarly dire. The fortress commandant, General Lieutenant Edmund Hofmeister, would send desperate radiograms to Army Group Center headquarters reporting chaos, loss of contact with subordinate units, and the impossibility of holding the position. These messages survive in fragmentary form in the Army Group Center communications log, and reading them in sequence produces a specific and unpleasant sensation. You are watching a man describe his own imminent destruction in the formal, clipped language of military communication. And the response from higher headquarters, when it comes at all, is an order to continue holding. The Feste Platz doctrine did not account for the possibility that the fortress might fall faster than the permission to withdraw could traverse the chain of command from Belarusia to East Prussia and back. When I cross-reference the Feste Platz garrison strengths with the Soviet forces assigned to reduce them, the mathematics are not merely unfavorable, they are terminal. At Vitebsk, Gollwitzer's 30,000 men would face 2 Soviet armies, the 43rd Army from the First Baltic Front and elements of the 3rd Belarusian Front, with an aggregate strength many times his own, supported by artillery densities that exceeded 200 guns and mortars per kilometer of front in the breakthrough sectors. At Bobruisk, the 9th Army's garrison would face the full weight of the 1st Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky, the strongest of the 4 Soviet front commands, with its dedicated tank and mechanized corps. The Feste Platz doctrine assumed that a surrounded garrison would tie down large numbers of enemy troops, but the Soviet operational method for Bagration was specifically designed to avoid that outcome. The plan called for mobile forces to bypass the fortified cities, leaving smaller formations to contain and reduce the garrisons while the main advance continued westward. The doctrine's central premise, that the enemy would be forced to stop and invest the fortress, was contradicted by the enemy's actual plan. Hitler was playing chess against an opponent who had read his playbook and designed a counter specifically to neutralize it. The human dimension of the Feste Platz doctrine is the one that keeps me awake, because unlike the intelligence failure or the force allocation mistake, which were errors of judgment, potentially correctable by better information or different personnel, the fortress doctrine was a deliberate ideological choice to sacrifice lives for a strategic principle that had already been disproven. The men garrisoning those positions didn't fail. They weren't outfought. They were placed in positions that could not be held, given orders that could not be obeyed without dying, and then denied permission to withdraw until the window for withdrawal had closed. The doctrine converted a military defeat, which might have been managed, mitigated, survived, into an annihilation. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is another thing to be ordered to lose it, by a man sitting in a bunker 1,000 kilometers away on the basis of a principle that the evidence had already shown to be wrong. On the 8th of March, 1944, Führer Order No. 11 was distributed to commands across the Eastern Front. It arrived in neatly typed copies, bearing the appropriate classification markings and signature blocks. Someone at a divisional headquarters wrote "madness" in the margin. History would prove the marginalia more accurate than the document. The commanders on the ground, the garrison officers, the divisional staff officers who read the order and understood its implications, what did they do with that understanding? Mostly, they complied. The German military system in 1944 did not leave much room for creative interpretation of direct orders from the Führer. Officers who had demonstrated independent judgment at earlier stages of the war, men who had conducted unauthorized withdrawals to save their units, had been relieved, court-martialed, or worse. The institutional learning of the German officer corps by this point in the war was not adapt to circumstances, but obey or be destroyed from above as surely as from in front. The Feste Platz doctrine was not merely a military order. It was the expression of a command culture that had replaced professional judgment with ideological obedience. And the men who would die in Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Mogilev, and Orsha in the last week of June were, in a precise and terrible sense, the final products of that culture. They had been ordered to stand in concrete coffins. They stood. Chapter 5. The Scream of 33,000 Guns. Sometime in the spring of 1944, in a motor transport battalion somewhere behind the Soviet front line in Belarusia, a driver climbs into the cab of a Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton truck. The truck was built in South Bend, Indiana. It was shipped across the Atlantic in a convoy, transferred at Murmansk or through the Persian corridor, loaded onto a Soviet rail flat car, and delivered to a supply depot, where it was assigned to a unit whose job is the least dramatic and most important task in the Soviet war effort: hauling artillery shells from railheads to forward ammunition dumps. The driver's name is lost. His face is lost. The serial number on his truck's data plate, stamped in English in the factory in Indiana, is lost. What isn't lost is the arithmetic of what his truck and tens of thousands of trucks like his made possible. The 4 Soviet fronts arrayed for Operation Bagration required, by conservative estimate, something in the vicinity of 300,000 tons of artillery ammunition pre-positioned in forward dumps before the offensive could begin. 300,000 tons. That's not a metaphor or an abstraction. It's a physical quantity of metal and explosive that had to be manufactured, loaded, transported by rail, transferred to trucks, driven forward on unpaved roads through forest and swamp, unloaded, stacked, camouflaged, and guarded. All without the Germans noticing. The shells couldn't fire themselves. Someone had to carry them to the guns. And the someone, more often than not, was driving an American truck. The Lend-Lease program's contribution to Soviet military capability is one of those subjects where the historiography itself is a battleground. And I want to acknowledge that honestly before we go further. During the Cold War, Soviet historians systematically minimized the role of Western material aid, insisting that the Soviet Union's victory was fundamentally a product of Soviet industry, Soviet sacrifice, and Soviet military science. Western historians, particularly American ones, sometimes overcorrected in the opposite direction, implying that Lend-Lease won the war for the Soviets. Neither position survives contact with the evidence. The current historiographical consensus, and I think it's right, is that Lend-Lease didn't win the war for the Soviet Union. Soviet factories produced the tanks, the aircraft, and the artillery that did the fighting. What Lend-Lease provided was the logistical skeleton that allowed those weapons to move. The United States shipped approximately 428,000 motor vehicles to the Soviet Union during the war. By 1944, American-built trucks, the Studebaker US-6, the Ford G8T, the Chevrolet G7503, constituted the backbone of Soviet motor transport. Without them, the Red Army could still have fought. But it could not have advanced at the speed it achieved during Bagration. The trucks didn't provide the strength, they provided the tempo, and in warfare, tempo kills. The Studebaker US-6 deserves a moment of specific attention because it was the single most important American vehicle on the Eastern Front, and its specifications explain why. Powered by a Hercules JXD 5.24-liter inline-six engine, producing 87 horsepower, with a payload capacity of 2.5 tons on improved roads or 1.5 tons cross-country, the US-6 was a six-wheel drive truck with relatively high ground clearance and a robustness that Soviet drivers, accustomed to the more fragile Soviet-produced ZIS trucks, found extraordinary. It could traverse the rutted, unpaved, mud-slicked roads of Belarusia with a reliability that no Soviet-manufactured equivalent could match. Soviet soldiers called it the Studer. They loved it not because it was glamorous, but because it started in the morning, carried its load without breaking down, and could be repaired by mechanics with basic tools and a reasonable supply of spare parts. The US-6 chassis served another function that carries a specific historical irony. The Katyusha multiple rocket launcher, the weapon whose shrieking salvos became the acoustic signature of the Soviet offensive, the sound that German veterans described as the most terrifying noise on the Eastern Front, was most commonly mounted on the US-6 chassis. The iconic image of Soviet rocket artillery, the weapon that sounds like the Eastern Front itself, rode on a truck built in Indiana. I keep returning to that detail. I don't think either country has ever been entirely comfortable with it. The ammunition supply chain that fed Bagration's opening barrage was a multi-stage logistical operation that began in factories east of the Urals and ended in camouflage dumps within a few kilometers of the front line. Shells were manufactured in plants that had been evacuated from Western Russia in the desperate autumn of 1941, disassembled, loaded onto trains, and reassembled in the Urals and Siberia in one of the most extraordinary industrial migrations in history. From these factories, the shells traveled by rail across the vast distances of the Soviet interior to railheads behind the Belarusian front. At the railheads, they were transferred to truck convoys, overwhelmingly Studebakers, for the final leg of the journey to forward dumps. The trucks moved at night, in blackout conditions, on roads that were often little more than dirt tracks reinforced with logs. Soviet military police controlled traffic at intersections to prevent congestion that might be spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft. The forward dumps themselves were dispersed, camouflaged with cut branches and netting, and guarded against partisan or German commando raids. The entire system had to deliver not just quantity, but timing. The shells had to arrive before the barrage could begin, and they had to be sorted by caliber, type, and intended target, so that each battery received the correct ammunition for its assigned fire plan. It was, in every sense, an industrial process applied to the problem of organized destruction. The barrage itself, when it came, was not a single event, but a rolling sequence that unfolded differently across each of the four fronts over the first days of the offensive, beginning on the 22nd of June, 1944. The artillery preparation employed a technique the Soviets had refined through years of hard experience: the rolling double barrage. Unlike a conventional preparatory bombardment, which hammered enemy forward positions and then lifted as the infantry advanced, the rolling double barrage engaged forward and rear positions simultaneously. One layer of fire suppressed the German frontline trenches and strongpoints. A second, deeper layer struck German artillery positions, command posts, and reserves in the rear. As the infantry advanced, both layers moved forward in coordination, creating a continuous curtain of fire that walked ahead of the assault troops. The purpose was to prevent the Germans from recovering between the end of the bombardment and the arrival of the infantry, to collapse the gap of time in which German defenders had traditionally reorganized, brought up reserves, and prepared counterattacks. The technique required precise coordination between artillery batteries, forward observers, and advancing infantry, a level of combined arms proficiency that the Red Army of 1941 could not have achieved, but that the Red Army of 1944 executed with lethal competence. The density of Soviet artillery in the breakthrough sectors is the single statistic from Bagration that I find most difficult to contextualize in a way that conveys its physical reality. In the Second Belarusian Front's main breakthrough sector, artillery concentration reached 181 guns and mortars per kilometer of front. In certain divisional sectors, the figure was even higher. The 61st Guards Rifle Division sector achieved a density of 234 guns and mortars per kilometer. To translate that into spatial terms, one gun or mortar every 4 to 5 meters along the front line. If you stood at one end of the breakthrough sector and looked along the line, you would see a gun, then another gun 4 meters away, then another, then another, stretching to the horizon, a continuous wall of steel tubes, each one loaded, each one aimed, each one about to fire. For comparison, at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British achieved an artillery density of approximately 1 gun per 17 meters of front, and that barrage was considered one of the heaviest in history to that point. The Soviets at Bagration had tripled that density. 28 years of artillery development, compressed into a single morning's work. When I was reading the Soviet General Staff's post-war operational study of Bagration, a dry, technical document not intended for public consumption, I found a passage that described the effect of the barrage on German positions in clinical, almost mechanical language. Structures destroyed, trenches collapsed, communications severed, personnel casualties significant. But what the study couldn't capture, and what no statistical analysis ever captures, is what it sounded like. 33,000 guns and mortars firing simultaneously across a front of hundreds of kilometers. The sound of an artillery barrage at this density doesn't register as discrete explosions. Veterans on both sides of the Eastern Front described it as a continuous roar, a physical vibration that you felt in your chest and your teeth rather than heard with your ears. The ground shook. Dust filled the air to the point where visibility dropped to meters. And this continued not for minutes but for hours. The Soviet fire plans called for sustained bombardment lasting up to 2 hours in some sectors before the infantry went forward. To me, the most telling detail about the barrage isn't its volume or its duration, it's its origin. Every shell that left every barrel that morning had traveled a supply chain stretching thousands of kilometers. From a factory in the Urals to a railhead in Belarusia to a forward dump to a gun position, carried for the last crucial miles on the back of a truck built in Indiana by workers who would never know the sound their labor produced on the other side of the world. The barrage did not fall uniformly across the front. Soviet planning was more sophisticated than simply massing guns and firing. Each front had a detailed fire plan that allocated specific batteries to specific targets based on weeks of reconnaissance, aerial photography, and in some sectors, ground observation by scouts who had crawled into no man's land to identify individual German positions. High-priority targets included command bunkers, artillery battery positions, communication nodes, and the entrances to the trench systems that connected German forward positions. Lower priority targets included reserve assembly areas, supply dumps, and secondary road junctions. The fire plans were sequenced. Certain targets received initial destruction fire aimed at physically demolishing them, followed by suppression fire aimed at keeping any survivors pinned down while the infantry advanced. The Katyusha rocket launchers added a particular dimension of terror. Unlike conventional artillery, which arrives in discrete impacts, a Katyusha salvo landed as a near-simultaneous carpet of explosions across a wide area, creating an effect that German soldiers described as the finger of God. The rockets were inaccurate by the standards of tube artillery. You couldn't hit a specific bunker with a Katyusha, but that was beside the point. Their purpose was area suppression, and at that task they were devastatingly effective. The German defenders who survived the opening hours of the barrage, and survival was largely a matter of geography, how deep your bunker was, how far from the main breakthrough sectors, described an experience of sensory overload followed by isolation. Communications wire was cut almost immediately by the shelling. Radio equipment was destroyed or rendered useless by the volume of fire. Commanders in forward positions lost contact with their battalions. Battalions lost contact with regiments. Regiments lost contact with divisions. The German defensive system depended on rapid, coordinated response, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, calling in artillery support, organizing local counterattacks, and the Soviet barrage destroyed the communication network that made coordination possible before the first Soviet infantrymen crossed the start line. In some sectors, German units fought the first hours of the battle as isolated platoons and companies, unaware of what was happening 50 meters to their left or right, unable to request support, unable to receive orders. The barrage didn't just suppress the defense, it atomized it. Soviet infantry began advancing behind the rolling barrage on the morning of the 22nd of June, supported by tanks equipped with mine-clearing plows, and followed by combat engineers tasked with clearing paths through any surviving minefields. In many sectors, the sheer weight of the bombardment had already done the engineers' work for them. Minefields detonated by the concussion of thousands of shell impacts, defensive wire shredded, trench walls collapsed. The initial penetrations varied by sector. In some areas, German defenders who had survived the barrage in deep bunkers emerged to fight with a tenacity that slowed the Soviet advance to a crawl. In others, the defense had been so thoroughly demolished that Soviet infantry advanced through the first line of positions almost unopposed, finding empty trenches, abandoned equipment, and the silence that follows the end of the world. The general offensive was underway. The sound of 33,000 guns, fed by 300,000 tons of shells, carried on American trucks, aimed by fire plans drawn from weeks of reconnaissance, had announced to Army Group Center that the 22nd of June, 1944, was the answer to the 22nd of June, 1941. The answer was not subtle. It was not proportional. It was the distilled expression of 3 years of industrial mobilization, logistical preparation, and institutional learning, delivered in a single morning to a force that had been stripped of its armor, denied permission to withdraw, and ordered to stand in place. What followed, in the hours and days ahead, would prove that the barrage was not the operation, it was the overture. Chapter 6. The Vitebsk Trap. The 24th of June, 1944. Vitebsk, a city on the western Dvina River in northeastern Belorussia, population gutted by 3 years of occupation, now the northern anchor of Army Group Center's defensive line, and one of 8 designated Feste Plätze that Hitler has ordered held to the last man. 2 days into Operation Bagration, the Soviet 43rd Army from the 1st Baltic Front and elements of the 3rd Belarusian Front have been driving north and south of the city in a double envelopment. German forces in the sector have fought with the desperate tenacity of men who know they are being encircled but cannot get permission to move. And on this day, the 24th, the jaws close. Soviet forces link up west of Vitebsk, and General Friedrich Gollwitzer's 53rd Corps, approximately 30,000 men, is trapped inside a pocket that is shrinking by the hour. What happens over the next 72 hours is not a battle in any conventional sense. It is the Feste Platz doctrine meeting reality, and the collision produces a particular kind of destruction, slow enough to be documented, fast enough that documentation changes nothing. The radiogram traffic between Gollwitzer's headquarters, the 3rd Panzer Army under Generaloberst Georg Hans Reinhardt, Army Group Center under Busch, and the Wolfschanze in East Prussia during these 72 hours, constitutes one of the most damning records in the entire war. It's damning not because anyone says anything extraordinary. The language is standard military communication, clipped and formal, but because the timestamps tell the story that the words don't. Gollwitzer identifies the encirclement and requests breakout authorization. The request travels up the chain, from 53 Corps to 3rd Panzer Army, from 3rd Panzer Army to Army Group Center, from Army Group Center to the Wolf-Schanze. At each level, the request is forwarded with endorsement. Everyone in the chain agrees that breakout is necessary, but no one in the chain has the authority to grant it without Hitler's personal approval. And Hitler, on the 24th, is engaged in a conference about the overall situation at Vitebsk. He is presented with the request. He refuses. Then, in what one source describes as an uncharacteristic reversal, he grants partial permission. One division, the 206th Infantry Division, may attempt to break out, while the remainder of the corps holds the city. The order arrives back down the chain. Gollwitzer receives it. And if you understand anything about military operations, you understand that this order is not a compromise. It is a guarantee of total loss. It ensures that the breakout force is too weak to succeed, while draining the garrison of some of its best troops. It is an order designed to lose both the fortress and the escaping division. The mechanics of what the Soviet forces accomplished at Vitebsk deserve scrutiny, Because the encirclement reveals the degree to which Soviet operational art had matured since the catastrophic early years of the war. The classic image of an encirclement is a wall, a continuous ring of troops surrounding the trapped force, preventing any exit. In practice, the Soviet encirclement of Vitebsk didn't look like that. Soviet forces didn't have enough troops to physically seal every meter of the perimeter. Instead, they established blocking positions on roads, bridges, and river crossings, the choke points that any large formation would need to use in order to withdraw in an organized manner. While mobile forces, tanks, and mechanized infantry patrolled the gaps between blocking positions. The trapped force, the 53rd Corps, lacked the fuel, the vehicles, and the mobility to exploit those gaps before they could be reinforced. It wasn't encirclement by wall, it was encirclement by paralysis. The Germans were surrounded not because every avenue of escape was physically blocked, but because every avenue of escape required a level of speed, coordination, and combat power that the encircled force no longer possessed. The technique was sophisticated, and it worked. Gulwitzer's post-war interrogation transcript, held in Soviet archives, portions of which have been published, offers a window into the experience of a man caught between an impossible order and an inescapable reality. A Soviet intelligence officer asked him, "When did you know you could not hold Vitebsk?" Gulwitzer's response, "On the 22nd, the first day." He knew on the first day that the position was untenable. The officer pressed, "Then why did you not withdraw on the 22nd? A long pause is noted in the transcript. The interrogator recorded the silence. Before Gulwitzer answered, "I was not permitted." 3 words that contain the entire pathology of the Feste Platz system. The commander on the ground identified the correct course of action on day 1. He spent 3 days requesting permission to execute it. Permission arrived, partially, inadequately, only after the window for execution had closed. I find myself reading that transcript and thinking about the 12 to 18-hour gap between when the partial breakout permission was finally issued and when the encirclement became tactically impenetrable. 12 to 18 hours. That's the margin between survival and annihilation, and it was consumed not by combat but by communication, messages traveling from a bunker in Belarusia to a bunker in East Prussia and back, through multiple levels of command, each level adding hours of delay, while the Soviet ring contracted. The breakout attempt, when it came on the 26th of June, was a study in futile courage. Gulwitzer, apparently disregarding the order that limited the breakout to a single division, attempted to fight his way out with the entire corps. This was, by that point, the only rational decision. Leaving part of the force behind to hold a position that was already collapsing served no purpose. But it was also impossible. The Soviet forces surrounding Vitebsk had been reinforced during the days of delay, and the blocking positions that might have been penetrated on the 23rd or 24th were now too strong. The 53rd Corps threw itself against the Soviet ring and was broken. The fighting was intense, and for some units, lasted into the 27th before organized resistance ceased. By the time the guns went quiet, the 53rd Corps had effectively been wiped out. Of the roughly 30,000 men who had been trapped, nearly all were killed or taken prisoner. The 4th Luftwaffe Field Division, a formation originally composed of surplus Luftwaffe personnel retrained as infantry, a practice that produced units of dubious ground combat quality, was annihilated in its entirety. A group of several thousand men attempted to fight their way westward through the forests. The number who actually reached German lines was in the hundreds. Gulwitzer himself was captured and marched into a captivity that would last more than a decade. He returned to West Germany in the mid-1950s. While the 53rd Corps was dying in the Vitebsk pocket, the Soviet offensive was already moving past it, which is the crucial point that the Feste Platz doctrine got wrong. The doctrine's premise was that a surrounded fortress would hold down the largest possible number of enemy forces, forcing the attacker to divert strength to contain it, and thereby weakening the main advance. At Vitebsk, this did not happen. The Soviet plan had accounted for the Feste Platz from the beginning. The encirclement of Vitebsk was assigned to specific formations, while other formations, the mobile corps and tank armies, bypassed the city entirely and continued driving westward. The garrison was contained and reduced by forces designated for that specific purpose, while the main offensive continued without slowing. The Feste Platz at Vitebsk did not tie down the largest possible number of enemy forces. It tied down only the specific formations assigned to destroy it, formations that would not have been available for other tasks regardless, because the Soviet plan had allocated them to this mission from the start. The doctrine had not merely failed, it had failed on its own terms. The broader consequences of Vitebsk's fall extended well beyond the loss of 30,000 men, devastating as that was. The destruction of the 53rd Corps and the collapse of German positions in the Vitebsk sector meant that 2 of the 3 corps of the 3rd Panzer Army had been effectively destroyed within the first 5 days of the offensive. Army Group Center's left flank, the entire northern wing of the defensive line, ceased to exist as a coherent military formation. The road to the southwest, toward Borisov and ultimately Minsk, was open. The road to the northwest, toward Plätze, where German forces linked Army Group Center with Army Group North, was similarly exposed. The Soviet First Baltic Front moved immediately to exploit the gap, advancing on Plätze to secure the right flank of the entire Bagration offensive. General Oberst Karl Hilpert, commanding the German garrison at Plätze, read the situation correctly and, critically, withdrew his forces on his own authority without waiting for permission from above. Plätze was taken by Soviet forces on the 4th of July without significant resistance. Hilpert's unauthorized withdrawal saved his garrison from the fate of Gulwitzers. The difference between the two outcomes was not tactical situation or force ratio. It was the willingness of one commander to disobey orders that he knew were wrong. When I review the sequence of events at Vitebsk in its entirety, from the opening barrage on the 22nd to the collapse of organized resistance on the 27th, what strikes me is not the Soviet superiority in men and materiel, which was overwhelming, or the skill of the Soviet operational plan, which was considerable. What strikes me is the timestamps on the radiograms. The hours and hours consumed by a message traveling from the front line to the Wolfschanze and back, each hour tightening the noose around 30,000 men. The German military system had historically championed a doctrine called Auftragstactik, mission-type tactics, in which the commander on the ground was given a mission and broad latitude to accomplish it as he saw fit, adapting to circumstances in real time without waiting for detailed instructions from above. It was one of the distinctive strengths of the German military tradition, and it had contributed to German tactical superiority throughout the war. But by 1944, Hitler had systematically dismantled Auftragstactik at the operational and strategic levels. Commanders could not withdraw without permission. They could not abandon a Feste Platz without permission. They could not even redistribute their own reserves without approval from the top. The command system that had once been the most agile in Europe had become the most rigid, and the rigidity was lethal. Vitebsk is the proof. The men of the 53rd Corps didn't die because the Soviet army was too strong, though it was. They died because their own command system was too slow. The silence that descended on Vitebsk after the 27th of June was the silence of an army that no longer existed. The positions that German engineers had fortified over months of labor, the bunkers and trench lines and observation posts, were now populated by Soviet troops who inherited them with a soldier's pragmatic indifference to who had built them. The roads around the city were littered with the debris of the failed breakout, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, the detritus that a military formation leaves behind when it ceases to function as an organized body. In the forest to the west, small groups of German survivors moved cautiously toward what they hoped were friendly lines, navigating by compass and rumor through territory that was now behind the Soviet advance, hunted by partisans who knew the terrain infinitely better than they did. Most did not make it. The few who did carried with them the knowledge of what had happened, knowledge that would ripple through Army Group Center's surviving formations with the corrosive effect of a confirmed nightmare. Vitebsk had fallen. The 53rd Corps was gone. The northern flank was open, and the fortress doctrine that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome had in fact ensured it. The question now, The question that was being asked simultaneously in every German headquarters from the 9th Army in the south to the fragmentary remains of the 3rd Panzer Army in the north was simple. If the Feste Platz couldn't hold at Vitebsk, with 30,000 men and the western Dvina River as a natural barrier, what was going to hold at Bobruisk, at Mogilev, at the other designated fortresses where identical orders were still in effect? The answer was already taking shape in the forests south of the Pripyat marshes, where Colonel General Pavel Batov was studying a topographic symbol on his map that said "impassable swamp," and deciding that he didn't believe it. Chapter 7. Through the Swamp. Bobruisk. The 24th of June, 1944. The southern sector of the Bagration front, southeast of Bobruisk, while the 53rd Corps is being sealed inside its tomb at Vitebsk, 500 kilometers to the south, Colonel General Pavel Batov is standing over a map table in the field headquarters of the Soviet 65th Army and contemplating a topographic symbol. The symbol denotes impassable marsh, a broad expanse of peat bog and waterlogged forest stretching south and southeast of Bobruisk, precisely where a direct flanking approach to the city would need to pass. German defensive planning has treated this symbol as a wall. Batov treats it as a door. In his memoir, published years later, he would write with unconcealed contempt, "German generals trusted a topographical symbol for impassable swamp and succumbed to a conciliatory idea that we would not be able to advance along the swamps." He was right to be contemptuous. He was also right to see opportunity where the Germans saw only mud. The direct approach to Bobruisk from the southeast was barred by strong German positions at Partisan, where General Hans Jordan's 9th Army had prepared layered defenses. A frontal assault against Partisan would have been costly and slow, exactly the kind of grinding attritional fight that the Soviet operational plan for Bagration was designed to avoid. Batov's alternative was audacious in concept and backbreaking in execution. Bypass the German defenses entirely by moving his army through the marshland that the Germans had left unguarded. The decision required more than boldness. It required engineering on an industrial scale. Soviet combat engineers surveyed multiple routes through the swamp and began constructing corduroy roads, log surfaces laid perpendicular to the direction of travel over the waterlogged ground, covered with brush and packed earth, to create a surface capable of bearing infantry, artillery, and eventually tanks. In Batov's memoir, he reproduces a hand-drawn sketch of the crossing routes, each annotated with estimated construction times. The side 1 route, someone wrote 24 hours and then crossed it out and replaced it with 18. The engineers beat their own estimate. The physical reality of building a road through a Belarusian peat marsh is worth pausing over, because the romanticized image of Soviet military engineering, heroic soldiers throwing logs into mud, obscures the grinding technical difficulty of the task. A combat engineer battalion could lay approximately 300 to 500 meters of corduroy road per day, depending on conditions. The logs were typically 15 to 20 centimeters in diameter, felled from nearby forest, dragged to the construction site, and laid in series. A second layer of brush and compacted earth was added on top. The load-bearing capacity of such a road was limited and unpredictable. Infantry could cross reliably, but tanks frequently broke through the surface, requiring immediate repair. Every meter of road was built by hand, in swamp water, under the threat of German observation and the constant harassment of insects that any veteran of Belarusian summers would remember long after they had forgotten the sound of artillery. The work was not heroic in any cinematic sense. It was labor, monotonous, exhausting, essential. On the first day of the advance through the marsh, the 65th Army penetrated German defenses up to 6 miles, a remarkable achievement for an attack launched from terrain the enemy hadn't bothered to defend. A tank corps followed the infantry to exploit the breach, grinding forward on the corduroy roads that were being extended almost in real time as the advance continued. The German response was confusion, followed by alarm. Jordan had not expected an attack from this direction. His forces at Partisan were oriented to defend against a frontal approach, and the Soviet emergence on his flank disrupted the entire defensive geometry of the Ninth Army's southern sector. Jordan reacted by deploying his sole mobile reserve, the 20th Panzer Division under General Lieutenant Mortimer von Kessel, first northward against the Soviet Third Army, which was attacking from the east, and then pivoting south against Batov's 65th. The division was competent, and its counterattacks were aggressive, but it was a single division attempting to plug two holes simultaneously. The 20th Panzer Division's fate illustrates a principle that I think is more important to understanding Bagration than any tactical detail. The sequential commitment of a lone reserve against multiple threats is the textbook failure mode of a defender who lacks depth. The division fought hard against the Third Army's penetration, blunted it temporarily, then was pulled out and redeployed against Batov. It fought hard again, was beaten back with heavy losses, and by the time it disengaged, its offensive capacity was spent. The division didn't fail because its soldiers or commanders were incompetent. It failed because there was only one of it. A competent reserve formation committed piecemeal against successive threats is consumed piecemeal, achieving local delays but no decisive result. Jordan's Ninth Army had one mobile reserve, and Bagration's operational design ensured that one reserve was insufficient. By the 27th of June, 5 days into the offensive, the trap was set. The 41st Panzer Corps and the 35th Corps of the Ninth Army were encircled around Bobruisk in a pocket roughly 20 miles in diameter. General Lieutenant Edmund Hofmeister, the fortress commandant at Bobruisk, sent a desperate radiogram to Army Group Center. No contact with the 35th Corps, chaos and panic in the city, situation untenable. The response from headquarters was the response that the Feste Platz Doctrine always generated: hold. That evening, the Red Army launched its assault on the city itself, and street fighting raged through the night. It was not a battle that favored the defender. Soviet forces had overwhelming firepower, complete air superiority, and the garrison that was already fragmented, undersupplied, and surrounded. When Hitler finally authorized a breakout on the evening of the 28th, a full day after Hofmeister's desperate radiogram, it was, as at Vitebsk, too late. The German units still capable of organized movement ran into a double ring of Soviet blocking positions on the morning of the 29th. A handful of tanks from the battered 20th Panzer Division led the remnants of the 41st Panzer Corps in a charge that punched through the inner ring, where they linked up with elements of the 12th Panzer Division fighting inward from outside the pocket. It was a feat of raw desperation and German tactical skill, and it saved a fraction of the encircled force. Disorganized survivors from the 35th Corps filtered north toward the 4th Army's positions over the following days. But the numbers told the real story. Approximately 80,000 German casualties resulted from the Bobruisk encirclement. Only around 14,000 survivors of the 9th Army eventually reached the retreating German lines. When I look at the Bobruisk operation in its totality, what strikes me isn't the scale of the destruction, though it was enormous, but the simplicity of the insight that enabled it. Batov didn't outfight the Germans at Bobruisk. He outthought them. The entire operation turned on the recognition that a topographic symbol was not a fact of nature but an assumption, and that assumptions, unlike rivers and mountains, can be negated by anyone willing to do the work. The Germans looked at the marsh on their maps and saw an obstacle. Batov looked at the same marsh and saw an undefended flank. The difference was not intelligence or courage. It was imagination. The swamp was on every map. It didn't occur to the German staff that someone would build a road through it, because the map said the road couldn't exist. The map was wrong, and 80,000 men paid for the error. The parallel destruction of the northern and southern flanks of Army Group Center, Vitebsk and Bobruisk, falling within days of each other, created a strategic situation that had no remedy within the existing German force structure. Both flanks were gone. The road to Minsk was open from the northwest and the southeast simultaneously. The 4th Army, the largest single formation in Army Group Center, was still in the center, retreating westward under relentless Soviet pressure. But its flanks were now exposed, and the forces that should have been protecting them no longer existed. The first phase of Bagration was complete. The second phase, the encirclement and destruction of the Fourth Army west of Minsk, was about to begin. The swamp southeast of Bobruisk is still there. The forests have reclaimed the corduroy roads that Batov's engineers built in the summer of 1944. The logs have rotted, the brush has decomposed, and the water table has risen back to its natural level. If you were to walk the route today, and people have, historians and battlefield tourists following Batov's memoir like a guidebook, you would find nothing. No marker, no monument, no trace of the road that carried an army. The swamp has returned to being what the German map said it always was, impassable. But for 18 hours in June of 1944, it wasn't, and that was enough. Chapter 8. The Charnel House Road, Orsha to Borisov. The 26th of June, 1944, Orsha has fallen. The German 78th Sturm Division, which had fought a rearguard action of genuine determination, has been overwhelmed. And now, on the roads leading west from Orsha toward Borisov and the Berezina River beyond, the Fourth Army is trying to do the thing that the Feste Platz Doctrine was designed to make unnecessary: retreat. The retreat is not orderly. It cannot be orderly because the communication network that would enable coordination, the telephone lines, the radio relays, the signal stations, has been destroyed by the opening barrage and the 5 days of continuous fighting that followed. German units are moving west in mixed columns, infantry on foot, horse-drawn wagons loaded with ammunition and wounded, the occasional motor vehicle burning precious fuel on roads that are deteriorating under the volume of traffic. And above them, unchallenged, the Soviet Air Force is hunting. Soviet aerial reconnaissance photographs from the 27th and 28th of June survive in the Russian State Film and Photo Archive, and they have a clinical quality that makes them difficult to look at for reasons that have nothing to do with their technical composition. Shot from altitude in clear weather, they show the road from Orsha stretching westward, a pale line through dark forest, choked with destroyed vehicles, overturned wagons, and shapes that are bodies. The road runs straight for kilometers. There is no crater pattern suggesting a single strike. The destruction is continuous, evenly distributed, the work of repeated passes by aircraft that had all the time in the world. 25 fully loaded German supply trains east of Orsha were overtaken by Soviet armored spearheads and destroyed. Not captured, destroyed, and their contents, the ammunition, food, and medical supplies that the retreating army needed to survive, burned on the sidings. The mechanics of what happened on that road follow a feedback loop that, once established, was nearly impossible to break. German columns moving along the road were mixed. Infantry marching at walking speed, horse-drawn transport moving slightly faster, motor vehicles moving faster still. When Soviet aircraft attacked the head or the tail of a column, the entire column halted. Halted columns bunched together as trailing units closed the gap. Bunched columns presented denser targets, attracting further airstrikes. Vehicles that attempted to leave the road to disperse became stuck in the soft ground flanking the roadbed. Stuck vehicles blocked the road for those behind them. The result was progressive paralysis. Each attack made the next attack more effective, and the column's only means of escape, the road itself, became the instrument of its destruction. Luftflotte 6, the German air fleet supporting Army Group Center, was outnumbered approximately 7-1 and could not establish even local air superiority over the retreat routes. Werner Haupt, a German veteran of the Eastern Front, whose published account is one of the few ground-level descriptions of the Fourth Army's retreat, described the experience in language that is precise rather than eloquent, which is why I chose it. Burning villages, guns and infantry fire, muffled explosions, and detonations mixed in with the thundering hurrahs, he wrote. Whoever fell out because of wounds or illness experienced the horrible fate of the abandoned. Marshes, rivers, thick forests, the heat of the sun, hunger, and lack of water had a terrible effect. What drove us on was the unshakable will to reach the German front. The passage doesn't describe fear. It describes heat, thirst, and the sound of boots in water. The fear is what remains after you've subtracted everything a man can name. The disintegration of the Fourth Army's command structure during this period is documented in the Army Group Center communications log, and the entries have a finality that no narrative embellishment could improve. The 12th Corps sent its last radio message at approximately 1400 hours on one of the retreat's critical days. After that, nothing. The signal simply stopped. The 27th Corps, positioned north of Mogilev, abandoned its positions and attempted to retreat toward Orsha, only to discover that Orsha had already fallen. Units that had maintained some semblance of order during the first days of the retreat began losing cohesion as road junctions were cut, bridges were blown, and the forests between the roads filled with Soviet partisans who knew every trail and had been waiting 3 years for this moment. General von Tippelskirch, the Fourth Army commander, issued orders by radio for a general retreat to the Berezina River and Borisov. Many units didn't receive the order. Those that did often couldn't execute it. I need to acknowledge something about the sourcing for this chapter that applies to the retreat as a whole. The German records are fragmentary precisely because the retreat destroyed them. Units that lost their headquarters vehicles lost their war diaries. Formations that disintegrated lost their records along with their cohesion. Soviet records, while more complete, carry their own distortions. Air-to-ground claims of vehicles destroyed are notoriously inflated in every air force, and the Soviet air forces were no exception. The result is that precise figures for the Fourth Army's losses during the retreat phase are estimates, not counts. What we can say with confidence is that the retreat consumed the Fourth Army as a fighting force. Units that entered the retreat as battalions emerged as companies. Companies emerged as squads. Squads emerged as individual men walking west through the forest with no map, no orders, and no certainty that the German line still existed. What the retreat from Orsha to the Berezina produced was not, strictly speaking, a military defeat in the traditional sense, a battle fought and lost. It was a dissolution. The Fourth Army didn't lose a battle on the road to Borisov. It lost its structural integrity. The sinews that held a modern army together, communications, logistics, command authority, mutual support between adjacent units, were severed one by one over the course of a week, and what remained was not an army, but a mass of individuals and small groups moving in roughly the same direction for roughly the same reason. The Soviet forces pursuing them, the Second Belarusian Front from the east, mobile formations of the Third Belarusian Front hooking in from the north, didn't need to fight pitched battles to destroy the Fourth Army. They simply needed to keep moving, keep cutting roads, keep flying, and let the physics of a disintegrating retreat do the rest. Among the 25 destroyed supply trains east of Orsha were hospital trains carrying German wounded. Soviet after-action reports note their capture but do not elaborate. Haupt's account mentions the wounded who fell out and experienced the horrible fate of the abandoned. What that phrase means, specifically, he doesn't say, and I'm not going to speculate beyond what the sources support. What I will note is this. By the 28th of June, the road from Orsha to the Berezina had become something that doesn't have a good English word. The Germans might have called it a Leichenfeld, a field of corpses, though even that doesn't capture the linear geometry of it, the way the destruction followed the road rather than spreading across a battlefield. It was a line of death, not an area. And it stretched for kilometers. The survivors who reached the Berezina River and the bridges at Borisov arrived at the last natural defensive line between the shattered front and Minsk. What they found there, a camp group under General Lieutenant Dietrich von Sacken, assembled from the fresh 5th Panzer Division and the formidable 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, holding the bridge crossings, would give the Fourth Army's remnants a brief and bloody reprieve. But the retreat itself had already accomplished the Soviet objective. The Fourth Army was no longer a coherent fighting force, and the forces that might have defended Minsk were strung out across 100 kilometers of forest and road, leaking strength with every kilometer. The road from Orsha to Borisov is, today, a modern highway. The forests on either side have been thinned by decades of logging and development. The supply trains are long gone, their rusted remains either salvaged for scrap in the post-war years or buried beneath new construction. The road carries civilian traffic now, trucks, cars, buses, and there is nothing along its length to indicate what happened there in the last week of June 1944. Nothing except the distance. You can drive it in a few hours. The men of the Fourth Army walked it in a week, and many of them didn't finish the journey. Chapter 9. Von Saucken's 76 Panthers, the last stand at Borisov. Late June 1944. The Berezina River at Borisov. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who replaced the dismissed Bush as commander of Army Group Center on the 28th of June, has been in command for less than 48 hours and is already making decisions that Bush was never permitted to make. One of his first acts is to assemble a blocking force at Borisov to cover the retreat of the Fourth Army's remnants across the Berezina. The force he cobbles together is, on paper, surprisingly strong. The 5th Panzer Division under General der Panzertruppe Karl Decker, recently refitted to near full strength, boasting a battalion of 76 Panther medium tanks. The 505th Heavy Tank Battalion with 45 Tiger heavy tanks, plus several military police companies and an engineer training battalion. The whole formation is placed under General Lieutenant Dietrich von Saucken. This is the last significant concentration of German armor in Army Group Center sector, and it has been assembled at the last river line before Minsk. The 505th Heavy Tank Battalion's War Diary, one of the most detailed unit records to survive from the Eastern Front, records the strength figure with the specificity that German administrative culture demanded even in extremis. 45 operational Tiger I heavy tanks. Each Tiger weighed approximately 57 tons. 45 of them represented roughly 2,565 tons of armored fighting vehicle, concentrated in a single battalion, positioned at a single river crossing, tasked with buying time for an army that was bleeding to death. The 5th Panzer Division's 76 Panthers added another 3,400 tons, give or take. The Panther weighed around 45 tons depending on variant. Combined, von Saucken's camp group represented almost 6,000 tons of some of the most capable armored vehicles in the world. Within a week, nearly all of it would be gone. The fighting at Borisov between the 29th of June and the 2nd of July was the single best German tactical performance during the entire Bagration campaign, and it deserves recognition as such, with the immediate caveat that tactical excellence, when divorced from operational coherence, is simply a more organized form of dying. Von Saucken's camp group held the Berezina crossings against the advancing Soviet 5th Guards tank army with a ferocity that inflicted genuine and documented losses on the Soviet armored formations. The Panthers, fighting from prepared hull-down positions on the western bank, exploited their excellent 75mm L-70 guns and strong frontal armor, 80mm of glacis plate angled at 55 degrees, to engage Soviet T-34s at ranges where German accuracy and armor protection gave them a decisive advantage. Soviet tanks approaching the river crossings were knocked out in significant numbers. The camp group bought the hours that the retreating remnants of the 27th and 12th Corps needed to reach the bridges and cross. But the arithmetic of attrition favored no one at Borisov. It simply consumed both sides at different rates. In the fighting northwest of Minsk on the 1st and 2nd of July, the 5th Panzer Division engaged the Soviet 5th Guards tank army in a series of actions that left the Soviet formation badly mauled. The 5th Guards tank army was, by some accounts, gutted, a term that implies losses sufficient to render it temporarily ineffective as an offensive formation. The cost, however, was terminal for the 5th Panzer. By the end of the fighting, the division was down to 18 operational panzers. Every single Tiger of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, all 45, had been destroyed or abandoned. Not lost in a single dramatic engagement, but ground away over days of rear guard actions, bridge defenses, and the relentless mathematics of attrition without replacement. When a Tiger was hit and disabled but not destroyed, it couldn't be recovered and repaired. The workshops were gone. The recovery vehicles were gone. The front was moving westward faster than a 57-ton tank with a damaged track could be towed. To me, The most revealing detail about von Saucken's defense isn't the kill ratios or the tactical deployments. It's the Panther's final drive. The Panther was, in many respects, the best medium tank of the war. Its gun was superb, its frontal armor was effective, and its cross-country mobility when functioning properly was excellent. But it had a fatal weakness in its transmission and final drive assembly, which was notoriously fragile and prone to failure under the stress of extended road marches. In a defensive battle, fighting from static positions, this weakness was irrelevant. The Panther could sit hull down and destroy enemy tanks at range all day. But the moment the Kampfgruppe had to retreat, the moment the defense at Borisov ended and the surviving vehicles had to drive westward on roads, in summer heat, under mechanical stress, the final drives began failing. Tanks that had survived Soviet shells were abandoned by the roadside because their transmissions had seized. The Panther was a weapon designed for a war of maneuver that had become a war of retreat, and the retreat destroyed it more effectively than Soviet anti-tank fire. Von Saucken ordered his men to withdraw behind the Berezina when Soviet forces fought their way into Borisov itself, and the position became untenable. The bridges were blown. The Kampfgruppe had accomplished its mission. It had held the crossings long enough for some portion of the Fourth Army survivors to escape the immediate pursuit. Stragglers continued to trickle into German lines for days afterward, making their way west through forests thick with partisans and scattered Soviet patrols. But the men von Saucken saved were marching into a larger catastrophe. The Fourth Army's remnants, having crossed the Berezina, were now west of the river but east of Minsk, and Minsk was about to become the center of the largest German encirclement since Stalingrad. I want to be careful about the framing here, because it would be easy, and I've seen it done in other documentaries, to turn von Saucken's defense into a heroic last stand, a redemptive moment within the larger disaster. And there was bravery at Borisov, unquestionably. Men fought and died with extraordinary skill and determination. But heroism requires purpose to be more than spectacle, and the purpose at Borisov was, in the final accounting, insufficient. The men who crossed the Berezina thanks to von Saucken's defense were not saved. They were given a few more days. The pocket that would close around them east of Minsk was already forming. The Kampfgruppe's sacrifice bought time, but time without a viable defensive plan is just a slower form of the same outcome. The 5th Panzer Division had been refitted to near full strength before Bagration, specifically because OKH expected the main Soviet offensive to come in Ukraine. It was a reserve formation pre-positioned for the wrong battle. Its destruction at Borisov was, in miniature, the story of the entire campaign. German strength, deployed in the wrong place based on faulty intelligence, consumed for a purpose that did not alter the strategic trajectory of the war by a single degree. The 76 Panthers and 45 Tigers that Model committed to the Berezina defense represented an armored force that, concentrated at the right place and time, could have significantly complicated the Soviet advance. Instead, they were fed into a rear-guard action that delayed the inevitable by approximately 72 hours. The 505th Heavy Tank Battalion's war diary, that meticulously maintained record of strength, losses, and operations, continues for a few more entries after Borisov. The entries become shorter. The strength figures decline in a way that reads less like a military record and more like a medical chart documenting a terminal illness. 45 Tigers, then fewer, then fewer. Then the diary's specificity becomes its own epitaph. The last entry recording operational Tiger tanks before the battalion was withdrawn for rebuilding reads 0. Not destroyed in battle or lost to enemy action, just a number. And the number is 0. The Berezina River, the river that Napoleon's Grand Army had crossed in catastrophic retreat in 1812. A crossing so traumatic that Berezina entered the French language as a synonym for disaster, had now witnessed a Second Army's destruction on its banks. The historical echo was not lost on Soviet propagandists, who drew the Napoleonic parallel explicitly in their reporting. But the parallel, while emotionally satisfying, was imprecise. Napoleon's army lost thousands at the Berezina crossing. The German Fourth Army was losing tens of thousands, and the river was not the climax of its destruction. It was a way station. The climax was coming. It was 80 kilometers to the west, and it was called Minsk. Chapter 10. The Fall of Minsk. 100,000 men in a cauldron. The 2nd of July, 1944. The vanguard of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps has reached the northwestern outskirts of Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, a city that has been under German occupation for 3 years. Simultaneously, and the simultaneity is not coincidence but operational design, a Soviet mobile task force has captured Nezvizh, roughly 100 kilometers to the southwest, cutting the German retreat route toward Baranovichi. The trap is closing from 2 directions at once. Inside the shrinking space between the Soviet pincers, the remnants of the German Fourth Army, perhaps 100,000 men, the shattered leavings of what was, 3 weeks ago, one of the most powerful field armies in the Wehrmacht, are stumbling westward through forests and along roads that are about to lead nowhere. On the morning of the 3rd of July, tanks from the 2nd Guards Tank Corps punched into Minsk from the northwest. German resistance inside the city collapsed rapidly. The garrison was not a fortress force in any meaningful sense, but a collection of rear echelon units, stragglers, and whatever combat formations happened to be within the city limits when the Soviet armor arrived. Before the encirclement sealed, the Germans managed to evacuate approximately 20,000 wounded and administrative personnel westward. But the bulk of the Fourth Army survivors, roughly 100,000 men by Soviet estimates, were now trapped in a large pocket east of the city. The Belarusian capital was liberated. The political significance was enormous, and the Soviet propaganda apparatus moved immediately to capitalize on it. But the military story was east of Minsk, in the forests, where 100,000 men had just been sentenced. The commander who inherited the impossible task of leading the encircled forces was General Vincenz Müller of the 12th Corps. Tippelskirch, the Fourth Army's commanding general, was outside the pocket. Müller was inside. The distinction was the difference between post-war memoirs written in a comfortable study and a decade in a Soviet prison camp. Müller took command of a force that barely qualified as a military formation. Units had lost contact with each other days earlier. Communications within the pocket were virtually non-existent. Ammunition was running out, food was gone, and the men were in varying states of physical and psychological collapse. Soviet artillery and fighter bombers pounded the pocket continuously, fragmenting it into smaller and smaller segments that could then be reduced individually by Soviet infantry. In the records of the Soviet 49th Army, one of the formations assigned to reduce the pocket, an after-action report describes the final days with a clinical detachment that is, in its way, more affecting than any dramatic narrative. Captured German soldiers stated that they had received no orders for 3 days, the report notes. When asked who their commanding officer was, most could not answer. An appendix lists captured equipment. The inventory runs for 7 typed pages. This is what an army looks like when it stops being an army, a 7-page list of abandoned objects and a population of men who no longer know who is in charge. The Soviet method for reducing the pocket was systematic rather than heroic, an industrial procedure applied to human beings. An outer ring of forces prevented any relief attempt from reaching the encircled Germans. An inner ring contained the pocket itself. Artillery and air power fragmented the pocket into isolated groups. Each group was offered surrender terms via loudspeaker and leaflet. Those that refused were destroyed by direct assault. The process was efficient, repetitive, and complete. On the 6th of July, a group of several thousand German soldiers under General Hans Traut, commander of the 78th Sturm Division, was overwhelmed and Traut was captured. 2 days later, on the 8th, Müller surrendered the remaining organized German forces southwest of Minsk. For the next several days, Soviet infantry and partisans combed the force, hunting down stragglers. Of the last 15,000 men trapped in the final phase of the pocket's reduction, approximately 900 managed to reach German lines. The rest were killed or captured. The mathematics of the Minsk pocket are worth confronting directly, because they contain a gap that no source has adequately explained. Soviet records claim approximately 57,000 prisoners were taken from the encirclement east of Minsk. German sources suggest that roughly 900 men escaped to their own lines. If the encircled force numbered approximately 100,000 and 57,000 were captured and 900 escaped, then somewhere between 40,000 and 42,000 men are unaccounted for. Some were killed in the fighting and the bombardment. Some died of wounds and starvation in the forests. Some were killed by partisans who had been living in those forests for 3 years and were not inclined toward the Geneva Convention. Many were simply never found. The Belarusian earth absorbed them as it had absorbed so many before: Soviet soldiers, Jewish civilians, partisan fighters, German occupiers. The forest floor does not distinguish between them. What strikes me most about the Minsk pocket is its speed. The entire encirclement, from the moment Soviet pincers closed on the 2nd of July to Müller's surrender on the 8th, lasted approximately 6 days. This challenges the popular conception of encirclement battles as prolonged, grinding affairs. Stalingrad lasted months, and even the smaller pockets of Barbarossa often held for weeks. The Minsk pocket collapsed in less than a week because the force inside it was already broken before the pocket formed. The Fourth Army hadn't retreated to Minsk, it had disintegrated toward Minsk. The units that found themselves east of the city when the trap closed were not organized formations conducting a fighting withdrawal. They were fragments, leaderless, exhausted, out of ammunition, out of hope. The pocket didn't need to be besieged. It needed only to be contained until it consumed itself. General Vincenz Müller's post-war trajectory is one of those biographical details that I find impossible to leave out, because it adds a dimension to the Minsk story that transcends the military narrative. After his surrender, Müller was taken to a Soviet prisoner of war camp. He cooperated with his captors. He was eventually repatriated, not to West Germany, but to East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, where he was given a commission in the new National People's Army and rose to the rank of lieutenant general. He served the state that his captors had built, and in 1961 he took his own life. I don't know what that means exactly. I don't think it has a single meaning, but it tells you something about the forces that operated on the men who survived the Minsk pocket. Forces that didn't end when the shooting stopped. The liberation of Minsk on the 3rd of July was, for the Soviet Union, a moment of genuine and justified triumph. The capital of Belarusia, lost in the catastrophic first weeks of Barbarossa, had been recaptured. The symmetry was deliberate and propagandistically potent. The Red Army had avenged 1941. But the liberation also revealed the cost of 3 years of German occupation. The city that Soviet troops entered was a ruin, not just physically, from the fighting, but demographically. The Jewish population of Minsk, which had numbered roughly 80,000 before the war, had been almost entirely annihilated in the ghetto and at the Mali Trostenets extermination site. The city the Soviets liberated was not the city the Germans had conquered. It was a shell, populated by survivors. 57,000 German prisoners were taken at Minsk. That number would soon acquire its own significance, because Stalin had plans for those men that went beyond the standard processing of prisoners of war. The prisoners would be cleaned, fed just enough to be presentable, loaded onto trains and sent to Moscow. They had one more public role to play before they disappeared into the camp system. The nature of that role, and the signal it was intended to send to 3 different audiences simultaneously, belongs to the next chapter. Chapter 11. The Great Waltz. 57,000 men through Moscow. The 17th of July, 1944. Moscow. A warm summer morning. Along the main thoroughfares of the Soviet capital, the broad avenues that Stalin's architects had designed for military parades and political demonstrations, crowds are gathering. NKVD troops line the route. The mood in the crowd, according to internal Soviet security reports that have been partially declassified since the early 1990s, is complex, anticipatory, hostile, curious, and in some cases openly grief-stricken, because the people lining these streets have spent 3 years burying their sons and brothers and husbands. And what they are about to see is, for many of them, the first tangible evidence that the dying has purchased something. The something is 57,000 German prisoners of war, about to be marched through the center of Moscow in two enormous columns. The operation has a code name. It is called the Great Waltz, after a 1938 American musical film about Johann Strauss. The irony of this naming, an American film title adopted by the Soviet NKVD to label the orchestrated public display of German prisoners, is a detail that I suspect no one involved had time to appreciate. The 57,000 prisoners had been selected from the more than 160,000 Germans captured during the Bagration offensive. The selection criteria were not humanitarian. The healthiest prisoners were chosen, men who could walk under their own power for the length of the route without collapsing, men who would present a suitably defeated but not pathetically emaciated appearance. Among them were 19 German generals, a fact that Soviet propaganda emphasized heavily. The prisoners had been transported to Moscow by rail, a logistical operation that, at roughly 50 men per cattle car, required approximately 1,140 rail cars, or something like 23 full-length trains. They had been fed enough to make the march, but not enough to make them look well. The management of their appearance was deliberate. They needed to look defeated, not dead. The distinction mattered because the parade was not merely a celebration. It was a communication, and its intended recipients were not all in Moscow. The march itself lasted hours. Two massive columns of prisoners moved through the city center, observed by hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians. The visual impact was staggering. An unbroken river of men in tattered German uniforms, stretching for kilometers through streets that, 3 years earlier, had been within range of German artillery. The acoustic dimension was significant too. Tens of thousands of boots on cobblestones, producing a continuous, arrhythmic shuffling that eyewitnesses described as audible from blocks away. NKVD crowd control reports from the day describe a range of reactions that defy the monolithic triumphalism of official Soviet accounts. Some spectators shouted insults, some threw objects, some stood in silence. Some women crossed themselves, some wept. Whether from grief, relief, rage, or some tangled combination that doesn't reduce to a single word, the reports don't specify, and the witnesses probably couldn't have said. After the last column of prisoners passed, water trucks and street sweepers followed, hosing down and scrubbing the pavement. This detail appears in every Soviet account of the parade, and its inclusion was not incidental. It was scripted. The sweepers were cleansing the streets of what Soviet propaganda described as fascist filth. The symbolism was heavy-handed by any standard, but heavy-handedness was the point. The message was not encoded. It was announced. These men dirtied our streets, and we are washing them clean. I think about the street sweepers more than I think about the prisoners, because someone with an instinct for theater decided to include them. The prisoners were the evidence. The sweepers were the verdict. The parade had 3 audiences, and understanding their separateness is essential to understanding why Stalin ordered it. The first audience was the Soviet domestic population, people who had been enduring the war's privations for 3 years and who needed visible, physical proof that the tide had turned. The second audience was the Western Allies, specifically the British and American governments and their publics. The timing of the parade, 5.5 weeks after D-Day, was not accidental. The message to London and Washington was unmistakable. While you have been fighting for a beachhead in Normandy, we have been destroying an entire army group. The scale of our victory dwarfs yours. Remember that when we sit down to discuss the post-war order. The third audience was the German military and civilian leadership. This is what happens to your armies in the East. There is no hope of holding. The prisoners themselves, the 57,000 men shuffling through the streets of a city most of them had expected to conquer, occupied a strange position in this choreography. They were simultaneously evidence, message, and spectacle. Their individual experiences, thoughts, and suffering were irrelevant to the purpose of the event. They were props in a production designed by the NKVD, and their role was to be seen, to be visibly numerous, visibly defeated, and visibly present in the capital of the nation they had tried to destroy. After the parade, they were loaded back onto trains and sent to prisoner of war camps across the Soviet Union. Most would spend years in captivity. Some would not return until the mid-1950s. Some would not return at all. I want to flag something about this event that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of historical analysis and moral judgment. The Third Geneva Convention, adopted in 1949, 5 years after the Great Waltz, explicitly prohibits subjecting prisoners of war to public curiosity. Article 13 of the Convention states that prisoners must at all times be protected against insults and public curiosity. By the legal standards that the international community would establish partly in response to the practices of the Second World War, the Great Waltz would constitute a violation of the laws of war. This doesn't mean we can't understand why Stalin ordered it, or acknowledge the genuine and legitimate rage of a population that had lost 27 million people. But it does mean that the event occupies a morally complicated space that triumphalist narratives, Soviet or otherwise, tend to flatten. The Western Allied reaction to the parade was a mixture of admiration and unease, documented in diplomatic cables and press coverage from the period. The sheer number of prisoners, 57,000, marched through a single city in a single day, communicated the scale of the Soviet victory more effectively than any communique could have. British and American newspapers reported the event prominently. The subtext was difficult to miss. The Eastern Front was producing results on a scale that the Western Front could not yet match, and the Soviet Union intended for the world to know it. The political implications for post-war territorial negotiations, for the balance of power in liberated Europe, for the emerging architecture of the Cold War that neither side yet called by that name, were left unspoken but understood. The logistics of the parade itself, the selection, transport, management, and public display of 57,000 human beings were handled by the NKVD with the same administrative competence they applied to the management of the Gulag system. This is not a coincidence or an irony, it is a structural feature. The Soviet state's capacity for organizing the movement and control of large numbers of human beings was the product of institutional experience that extended well beyond the military sphere, and the Great Waltz drew on that experience with practiced efficiency. The parade was, in administrative terms, a small operation compared to the NKVD's routine activities. After the 17th of July, the 57,000 prisoners of the Great Waltz disappeared into the Soviet camp system. The same system that held millions of Soviet citizens. The street sweepers finished their work. The crowds dispersed. The cobblestones dried in the summer sun. And in Belarusia, where the prisoners had been captured, the Soviet offensive continued westward, carrying the war toward Poland, toward the Vistula, and toward a city where the convergence of military operations and political calculations would produce one of the most agonizing episodes of the entire war. Chapter 12. The Commandant's Departure, Mogilev's Last Days. The 28th of June, 1944, Mogilev, a city on the Dnieper River in central Belarusia, one of 8 designated Feste Plätze in Army Group Center's sector. The Soviet Second Belarusian Front, under General Grigory Zakharov, has crossed the Dnieper north and south of the city and is now assaulting from multiple directions simultaneously. Inside the city, the garrison, assigned a fortress commandant, ordered to hold to the last man, furnished with the same rhetoric of duty and sacrifice that had been issued to Vitebsk and Bobruisk, is fighting a battle whose outcome was determined before it began. The last signal from the Mogilev garrison, recorded in Army Group Center's fragmentary communications log, reports the fall of the city center and the elimination of the final organized German positions in the vicinity of the railroad station. The message is not dramatic. It reads like a warehouse inventory being finalized. Position lost, garrison eliminated, transmission ending. I'm including Mogilev in its own chapter, not because it was the most dramatic of the Feste Platz battles, it wasn't, but precisely because it was the least dramatic. Vitebsk had the agony of the breakout attempt and Golvitzer's interrogation transcripts. Bobruisk had the swamp crossing and the desperate final charge of the 20th Panzer Division's remnants. Mogilev had none of these. It was a fortress city that was assaulted, overwhelmed, and taken by storm in less than 48 hours of serious fighting, and its garrison was destroyed with a mechanical efficiency that produced no memorable narrative, only a result. And that ordinariness is exactly why it matters, because the Feste Platz doctrine that destroyed Army Group Center was not a dramatic doctrine. It was a bureaucratic one. Its consequences were bureaucratically final. The assault on Mogilev followed the Soviet pattern for urban reduction that had been refined through years of painful experience. The assault battalion, the basic tactical unit for urban combat, was organized as a combined arms team, infantry at the core, combat engineers carrying explosive charges for demolishing bunkers and strongpoints, and direct-fire artillery, typically 76mm guns, brought forward to engage fortified positions at close range. The engineers would identify a strongpoint. The artillery would fire directly into it from ranges measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. The infantry would assault through the breach. Then the formation would move to the next strongpoint and repeat the process. It was efficient, brutal, and repetitive. A procedure rather than a tactic, optimized for throughput rather than elegance. The garrison at Mogilev was not large enough or well supplied enough to contest this process for more than a brief period. Major General Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, the fortress commandant, had been specifically appointed with orders to hold the city, orders identical in spirit and language to those given at Vitebsk and Bobruisk. The garrison fought. German soldiers in the buildings around the railroad station held out long enough for the final signal to be transmitted. Then they were overwhelmed. Approximately 2,000 German prisoners were taken. The garrison's pre-assault strength had been considerably higher than 2,000. The discrepancy implies heavy casualties during the fighting, though the exact figures are uncertain because the garrison records did not survive. The Feste Platz order for Mogilev had specified that the garrison was to hold the city in order to tie down Soviet forces. The same rationale applied to every fortress position. The reality at Mogilev falsified this rationale as thoroughly as Vitebsk had. The Second Belarusian Front took Mogilev without diverting significant forces from its main westward advance. The formations that assaulted the city were those designated for that specific purpose in the pre-offensive plan. The mobile and exploitation forces continued moving west without pausing. The garrison was destroyed. The Soviet timetable was not measurably delayed. The doctrine's stated purpose, to impose costs on the attacker by forcing the diversion of large forces, was achieved exclusively against the defender. Mogilev cost the Germans a garrison. It cost the Soviets the time it took to drive through a city. When I cross-reference the outcomes at all four of the major Feste Plätze that fell during the first phase of Bagration, Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Mogilev, and Orsha, the pattern is so consistent that it reads less like a military case study and more like a controlled experiment with identical results across multiple trials. In each case, the garrison was ordered to hold. In each case, Soviet forces bypassed or enveloped the position, while dedicated assault forces reduced it. In each case, the garrison was destroyed without significantly delaying the main Soviet advance. In each case, the permission to withdraw, when it came at all, arrived after the opportunity for withdrawal had passed. The doctrine didn't fail in one location and succeed in another. It failed everywhere, for the same reasons, in the same way. The sample size was 4. The failure rate was 100%. Mogilev's fall, combined with the concurrent destruction at Vitebsk and Bobruisk and the loss of Orsha, meant that by the end of June 1944, every major anchor point of Army Group Center's original defensive line had been taken. The Feste Plätze that were supposed to function as breakwaters, holding the Soviet flood while mobile reserves counterattacked, had been submerged one by one. There were no mobile reserves. There was no counterattack. There was only the retreat of the Fourth Army and the disintegration that retreat produced. The first phase of Bagration was complete. The second phase, the drive to Minsk and the encirclement of the Fourth Army, was already underway. The fortresses had served their final function, though not the one Hitler intended. They had converted a defeat into an annihilation by binding irreplaceable troops to indefensible positions and forbidding the one response that might have saved them. The railroad station where the last organized German resistance in Mogilev was extinguished is still there. Mogilev is, today, a functioning city in the Republic of Belarus, population roughly 380,000. The station has been rebuilt. Trains still run. The physical traces of the fighting, the shell impacts, the collapsed walls, the debris of urban combat, were cleared in the post-war reconstruction. And the city bears no obvious scars from the events of June 1944. There is no particular reason a traveler passing through would know that a garrison had been destroyed there, that a fortress commandant had received orders to die and had obeyed them, that the last radio signal had gone out from somewhere near the tracks. The city has other history, other stories, other concerns. But the document that killed the garrison, Führer Order No. 11, dated the 8th of March, 1944, remains in the archives. It has not been rewritten or rebuilt. It sits in its folder in the Bundesarchive, typed and official, bearing the classification markings and signature blocks of the organization that issued it. The margin annotation, Wahnsinn, is still there too, if it was ever really there at all. And the record of the 4 fortress cities that it sentenced to destruction, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, each one a controlled experiment in doctrinal failure, each one producing identical results, constitutes one of the clearest demonstrations in military history of what happens when ideology replaces observation as the basis for command decisions. The concrete coffins that Hitler ordered built across Belorussia fulfilled their function after all. They just didn't protect the people inside them. The silence that settled over the Mogilev railroad station on the evening of the 28th of June was a small silence, a footnote in the larger catastrophe consuming Army Group Center across a front of 1,000 kilometers. No one would write a memoir about it. No general's reputation would hinge on its defense or its fall. It was an ordinary destruction, carried out according to an ordinary procedure, producing ordinary results. And that ordinariness, the sheer mundane predictability of the outcome, is the most damning verdict on the doctrine that caused it. Chapter 13. Model's Firebreak, the man who arrived too late. The 28th of June, 1944. Somewhere west of Minsk, in a hastily requisitioned building in the town of Lida, a new commander is taking stock of a catastrophe that is still unfolding. General Feldmarschall Walter Model has been in command of Army Group Center for less than 24 hours. His predecessor, Bush, was dismissed by Hitler earlier that day, sacked by telephone, according to some accounts, which seems fitting for a man whose defining failure was an inability to make himself heard through the communication channels of the German command system. Model's headquarters at Lida is roughly 100 miles west of Minsk, and his staff cannot tell him with certainty where his own divisions are. The radios are largely silent, the telephones are dead. Contact between the Army Group headquarters and its scattered formations is being maintained, when it can be maintained at all, by Fiesler Storch light aircraft, fragile, fabric-covered liaison planes that land on open fields and carry handwritten messages. Model was not chosen for this assignment because he was liked. He was chosen because he was effective. Known within the German command as Hitler's fireman, the troubleshooter dispatched to sectors in crisis, he had already commanded Army Group North and Army Group North Ukraine in rapid succession during 1944, stabilizing collapsing fronts through a combination of tactical skill, ruthless energy, and a personal relationship with Hitler that allowed him to extract concessions, reinforcements, permissions, flexibility that other commanders could not obtain. This last quality was arguably the most important thing he brought to Army Group Center. Bush had been denied reserves. Bush had been denied withdrawal authority. Model, within hours of assuming command, began receiving both. The divisions that might have saved Army Group Center had been available before the 22nd of June. They were released after the 28th. The variable was not logistics or strategy. It was the personal chemistry between a dictator and his generals. Model's first directive as commander tells you everything you need to know about how he read the situation. The order, reconstructed from surviving signals, intercepts, and staff accounts, directed all available units to establish a new defensive line running through Molodechno, northwest of Minsk. The directive contains no reference to holding any fortress city, no mention of last man, no mention of the Feste Platz doctrine. Model had been in command for less than a day and had already, implicitly, repudiated the doctrine that had caused the disaster he was now trying to contain. He didn't formally countermand Führer Order No. 11. That would have been political suicide, even for a commander with his standing. But in practice, his operational directives prioritized mobile defense and fighting withdrawal over static position holding. It was a subtle but critical act of command disobedience, executed not through defiance, but through omission. The reinforcements that began arriving in Model's sector over the following days were real but inadequate. A cupful of concrete poured into a breach the size of a river. Divisions released from OKH Reserve and transferred from Army Group North represented approximately 50,000 to 70,000 fresh troops. Army Group Center had lost over 300,000. The math was not encouraging. Moreover, the arriving divisions could not be massed for a coordinated counterattack because there was no coherent front line behind which to assemble them. They were committed piecemeal, plugged into gaps as they appeared, thrown against Soviet spearheads as they advanced, consumed in a series of local actions that slowed the Soviet advance without stopping it. The question of whether Model stabilized the front after Bagration is one of the enduring debates in the historiography of the Eastern Front, and I want to address it directly because I think the answer is more nuanced than either side usually admits. German post-war accounts and some Western military historians credit Model with a near miraculous achievement, taking command of a shattered army group and somehow constructing a new defensive line that halted the Soviet advance by mid-August. Soviet and Russian historians offer a different explanation. The offensive halted not because of anything Model did, but because the Red Army had outrun its own supply lines. After advancing roughly 600 kilometers in 5 weeks, Soviet logistics were strained to their limits. Standard Soviet doctrine estimated that a front-level offensive could be sustained for approximately 250 to 300 kilometers before requiring a major pause for resupply. Bagration had exceeded that estimate by a factor of 2. The truth, as I read the evidence, is that both factors operated simultaneously. Model's actions mattered. Soviet logistics exhaustion mattered. Disentangling their relative contributions is probably impossible, and insisting on a single explanation says more about the historian's ideological commitments than about the historical evidence. The Feisler Storch, the tiny aircraft that served as Model's primary means of communication during his first days in command, deserves a moment of attention because it embodies the desperation of the situation in a way that operational summaries cannot. The Fi-156 Storch was powered by an Argus AS-10C inverted V8 engine, producing 240 horsepower. Its stalling speed was approximately 50 kilometers per hour, so slow it could land on virtually any open field, a crucial capability when every airfield in the sector had been overrun or was under Soviet air attack. It could carry a pilot and one passenger, or a pilot and a small cargo of documents. It was not a communication system, it was a last resort. And for several days in late June and early July 1944, the command of an entire army group, the coordination of hundreds of thousands of men across a front of hundreds of kilometers, depended on the ability of these fragile aircraft to find, land near, and deliver messages to units whose locations were often uncertain. Model interests me more than any other German figure in this story, and I've spent some time trying to understand why. I think it's because he is the only German commander in the Bagratian narrative who arrives without illusions. Bush knew the situation was bad, but accepted orders he knew were wrong. Gallwitzer knew Vitebsk couldn't be held, but waited for permission to leave. Jordan knew the Ninth Army was in danger, but committed his reserve piecemeal because the system gave him no alternative. Model arrived, looked at the wreckage, and began building something new. He didn't try to save what was lost. He didn't waste time or troops on hopeless positions. He accepted the destruction of the old Army Group Center as a fact and began constructing a replacement. That requires a different kind of courage than holding a fortress. The courage to acknowledge that everything behind you is gone and to start from whatever is in front of you. The new defensive line that Model attempted to establish ran roughly north-south through the area west of Minsk, anchored on whatever geographic features and surviving formations were available. It was not a continuous line in the traditional sense. There were gaps, weak points, and sectors held by nothing more than scattered Kampfgruppen and alarm units cobbled together from rear echelon personnel. But it was something. It was a structure. And as July progressed and the Soviet advance began to slow, partly due to Model's efforts, partly due to logistical friction, partly due to the inherent difficulty of sustaining a 600-kilometer advance, the structure began to solidify into something resembling a front. Model's personal fate casts a long shadow backward over his performance at Bagration. In April 1945, less than a year later, he would find himself commanding Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket. Another encirclement, another disintegration, another commander facing the arithmetic of inevitable defeat. This time, there would be no new front line to build. On the 21st of April, 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and took his own life rather than surrender. The man who had built a fire break in the ruins of Army Group Setter could not build one in the ruins of the Reich. The Fiesler Storch aircraft that carried Model's first orders across the burning wreckage of Army Group Setter were, by any standard, absurdly inadequate for the task. A fabric-covered biplane, carrying handwritten messages, flown by pilots navigating by visual reference over a landscape obscured by smoke and confusion. This was not command and control in any modern sense. It was improvisation. And yet it worked, just barely, just enough, to impose some degree of order on a situation that had passed beyond the reach of every other instrument of command. The Storch couldn't save Army Group Center. Nothing could. But it could carry the first fragile threads of a new structure forward into the chaos. And Model, the fireman, wove those threads into a line that held long enough for the catastrophe to end, and a new, smaller catastrophe to take its place. Chapter 14. The Liberation of the Death Camps, Majdanek. The 24th of July, 1944, Lublin, Eastern Poland. Elements of the First Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky have reached the outskirts of the city as part of the Lublin-Brest offensive, the westward extension of Bagration into Polish territory. The advance has been rapid, and the speed matters for a reason that has nothing to do with the military situation. On the eastern edge of Lublin, there is a facility that the German administration has been attempting, with increasing urgency, to dismantle. They have not had enough time. When Soviet troops enter the perimeter of the Majdanek concentration and extermination camp, they find gas chambers, crematoria, and warehouses full of the possessions of the dead. The Germans have destroyed some evidence. They have not destroyed enough. Majdanek was not the largest of the Nazi extermination facilities. Auschwitz-Birkenau, still months away from liberation, held that distinction. But it was the first to be encountered by any Allied army, and the condition in which it was found shocked even soldiers who had spent 3 years fighting the most brutal war in human history. Among the first photographs taken after liberation, one shows a Soviet soldier standing before a warehouse containing hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes. The shoes belonged to victims. They had been collected, sorted, and stored with the administrative precision that characterized the German camp system. The weight of 800,000 pairs of shoes, at roughly 1 kilogram per pair, is 800 metric tons. 800 tons of shoes. The statistic is precise and meaningless at the same time. The mind processes the number, but cannot connect it to the 800,000 human beings who once wore them. The initial Soviet investigation of Majdanek produced a casualty estimate of 1.5 million victims, a figure that was widely reported in the international press and that would later prove to be significantly overstated. Subsequent research, conducted over decades, revised the figure downward to approximately 78,000. The disparity between the initial claim and the documented figure is not trivial, and its consequences extended well beyond the historical record. When Western journalists and diplomats received the Soviet reports of Majdanek, some reacted with skepticism. Not because they doubted that atrocities had occurred, but because the scale of the Soviet claims seemed propagandistically inflated. This skepticism, fed by an inaccurate number, would persist for months, even after photographic and physical evidence was made available. The Soviets had the evidence. They overstated it, and the overstatement provided a foothold for doubt. I debated whether to include this chapter in a military documentary. The liberation of Majdanek was a consequence of Bagration, not a component of it. No operational order referenced the camp. No Soviet commander diverted forces to reach it faster. The camp was simply there, in the path of the advance, and the advance uncovered it. But I think the separation between military event and consequence of military event is false in this case. The operation that destroyed Army Group Center also opened the door to the physical evidence of what had been happening behind the lines that Army Group Center had been defending. That connection is not incidental. The military narrative and the moral narrative converge at Majdanek, whether or not the operational maps acknowledge it. The world's first opportunity to confront the industrial reality of the Nazi extermination system came directly from Bagration's success, a causal chain that is almost never drawn in popular history. Majdanek was liberated on the 24th of July, 1944. Auschwitz would not be reached until January 1945. The Western Allies would not encounter Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, or Dachau until April 1945. 9 months later. For 9 months, Majdanek was the primary physical evidence available to the world, and for 9 months, a significant portion of the Western public was uncertain whether to believe what the evidence showed. The photographs were published. The warehouses were documented. Soviet and Polish investigators compiled reports, and still, doubt lingered, partly because of the inflated casualty figure, partly because of a general inability to absorb the reality of what had happened, and partly because the source of the information was the Soviet Union, whose propaganda apparatus had earned a reputation for exaggeration that in this case undermined the credibility of claims that were, in their substance, horrifyingly true. The Soviet war correspondents who entered Majdanek on or shortly after the 24th of July left accounts that are notable for their rawness. These were writers accustomed to the language of Soviet propaganda: heroic workers, fascist beasts, the inevitable triumph of socialism. Majdanek defeated that language. The correspondents describe what they saw in terms that are groping, uncertain, reaching for a vocabulary that doesn't exist because the thing they are describing had not previously existed in their conceptual framework. They had seen battlefields. They had seen the destruction of cities. They had not seen gas chambers and crematoria designed, built, and operated for the sole purpose of killing human beings on an industrial scale. The shock in their writing is not rhetorical. It is the shock of a mind encountering something for which it has no pre-existing category. There is a cruel postscript to the liberation of Majdanek that belongs in this chapter because it illustrates the political dimension of Bagration's advance that the military narrative alone cannot capture. After the surviving prisoners were evacuated and the initial investigations completed, the Soviet authorities repurposed the camp infrastructure to detain members of the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, who had been fighting the Germans in coordination with the Soviet advance, and who now found themselves classified as enemies of the Soviet-backed political order in Poland. The barracks that had held victims of the Nazi regime now held opponents of the Soviet regime. The infrastructure of imprisonment was repurposed, not dismantled. The locks worked the same way for both sets of occupants. The significance of Majdanek for the Bagration narrative extends beyond the moral dimension, important as that dimension is. The camp's liberation marked the moment when the Soviet offensive crossed from the territory of the pre-war Soviet Union into Poland, a geographic and political threshold that would reshape the remainder of the war and the post-war order. East of Lublin, the Red Army was liberating Soviet territory. West of Lublin, it was entering a political landscape in which liberation and occupation would become increasingly difficult to distinguish. The Polish population's relationship with the advancing Soviet army was profoundly ambivalent. The Soviets were driving out the Germans, which was welcome, but they were also imposing a political order that the Polish resistance, particularly the Home Army, had not fought for and did not want. The question of how atrocity evidence is documented, verified, and received by the international community is not a 1944 problem alone. In 2026, with satellite imagery, open-source intelligence tools, and near-instantaneous global communication, the speed at which atrocities can be documented has increased enormously. But the Maidanic precedent suggests that the bottleneck is not documentation, it is belief. The evidence at Maidanic was physical, photographic, and available within days of liberation. It was still met with skepticism. The problem was not the data. It was the audience's capacity, or willingness, to process what the data showed. The shoes remain the image that endures from Maidanic's liberation. Not the gas chambers, not the crematoria, not the barracks or the guard towers, the shoes. Hundreds of thousands of them, piled in a warehouse, each pair once belonging to a specific human being who walked in them, wore them down, laced them up in the morning. The shoes are ordinary objects, made extraordinary by their quantity and their context. 800,000 pairs, 800 tons. The numbers are precise. The meaning exceeds what numbers can carry. Chapter 15. Wilno and the Polish Question. The 7th of July, 1944, Wilno, known today as Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, but in 1944, a city whose national identity was itself contested. Lithuanian, Polish, and Soviet claims overlapped across it like competing maps drawn on the same sheet of paper. Soviet forces from the 3rd Belarusian Front, the 5th Guards Tank Army, and the 3rd Guards Tank Corps are approaching from the east, swinging around the city from both north and south in the characteristic double envelopment that has become the operational signature of Bagration. Inside the city, roughly 12,000 German troops under General Major Rainer Stahl are manning prepared defensive positions. And somewhere in the streets and basements, armed men and women of the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, are preparing to rise. The AK uprising in Wilno was part of a broader Polish strategy known as Operation Tempest, a nationwide plan for the Home Army to engage the Germans in coordination with the approaching Soviet forces, establish Polish administrative control over liberated cities, and thereby present the Soviet Union with a political fait accompli, a functioning Polish authority loyal to the government in exile in London, already in place when the Red Army arrived. The strategy was brave, desperate, and doomed. It assumed that the Soviet Union would accept the AK's presence as a legitimate political partner rather than viewing it as a rival to be eliminated. This assumption was wrong, and the events at Wilno would demonstrate just how wrong before the month was out. The battle for Wilno lasted 6 days and was fought on 3 sides simultaneously. Soviet forces attacking from outside, AK fighters attacking from inside, and the German garrison defending against both. The fighting was intense and casualties were severe on all sides. Stahl's 12,000 Germans held strong positions in a city whose old architecture, stone buildings, narrow streets, thick walls, favored the defender. Soviet assault forces were slowed by the urban terrain. AK fighters, operating in smaller groups with lighter weapons, struck at German positions from unexpected directions, disrupting defensive coordination. The three-way battle gave Wilno a chaotic, layered quality that conventional military narratives struggle to capture. It was not a siege or an assault or an uprising, but all three at once. On the 12th of July, Stahl ordered a breakout. The 6th Panzer Division and elements of Panzer Grenadier Division Grossdeutschland, one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, launched a coordinated night attack against the Soviet encirclement ring and succeeded in opening a narrow corridor. The corridor held for approximately 12 hours. 3,000 Germans escaped through it before Soviet forces sealed the gap. The remaining garrison was destroyed, 8,000 killed, 5,000 captured. The tactical execution of the breakout was impressive, a night attack against established blocking positions, requiring coordination between the relief force outside and the garrison inside, under conditions of near-total Soviet air superiority. It was also, in the larger scheme of Bagration, a footnote. 3,000 survivors subtracted from an army group that had already lost 300,000. What happened after the battle is the reason this chapter exists. Once Vilno was securely in Soviet hands, NKVD internal security units moved in and began systematically disarming and arresting members of the Polish Home Army. The AK fighters who had spent 6 days fighting the Germans alongside the Soviets, taking casualties, expending irreplaceable ammunition, suffering and dying in the same streets, were now informed that their weapons must be surrendered and their organization dissolved. Those who refused were detained. Those who escaped went underground. The coded radio messages from the AK command in Vilno to the Polish government in exile in London, preserved in the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum, document the unfolding betrayal in real time. One message, dated the 13th of July, reads, "City liberated. Soviet forces demanding we disarm. Await instructions." The reply from London arrived the following day. Maintain contact. Negotiate. There was nothing to negotiate. The AK officers in Vilno believed they were fighting alongside the Soviets. They were. But alongside and for are different prepositions, and in July 1944, the distinction was lethal. The Soviet Union had no intention of accepting an armed Polish force loyal to the London government in exile, operating behind its front lines. The AK was not merely a military inconvenience, it was a political threat, a rival claimant to authority in post-war Poland, backed by a government that Stalin intended to marginalize and ultimately replace. The disarming of the AK at Vilno was not an improvised decision by a local NKVD commander. It was policy, executed consistently and deliberately, and it revealed something about the nature of Bagration's advance that the purely military narrative obscures. The offensive was not simply a campaign to destroy Army Group Center. It was a campaign to establish Soviet political control over the territories through which it passed. The Vilno pattern, military liberation followed by political subordination, would repeat itself with devastating consequences 3 weeks later at Warsaw. The AK command in London had the Vilno precedent available when Warsaw rose on the 1st of August. They knew what the Soviets had done to the AK fighters who had helped liberate Vilno. They rose anyway, betting that the scale of the Warsaw Uprising and the proximity of Western Allied attention would force a different outcome. The bet failed. But that story belongs to the next chapter. I find the Vilno episode difficult to write about without anger, which is a problem for a historian who is supposed to maintain analytical distance. The AK fighters at Vilno did something that any military alliance should honor. They fought the common enemy at great personal cost, in coordination with their ally, and contributed to a shared victory. The response they received, disarmament, arrest, imprisonment, was not a misunderstanding or a communication failure. It was a deliberate act by a state that had already decided the AK's existence was incompatible with its post-war objectives. The fact that the Soviet Union had legitimate security concerns about armed formations in its rear area does not change the fundamental character of what happened. You can explain it, you cannot justify it. The German garrison's breakout from Vilno, that narrow corridor held open for 12 hours by the 6th Panzer Division and Grossdeutschland, has one final detail worth noting. The relief operation was one of the last successful German tactical actions during Bagration, and it required the commitment of 2 formations that were desperately needed elsewhere. Every Panther and Panzer Grenadier spent opening a corridor for 3,000 men at Vilno was a Panther and Panzer Grenadier not available for the defense of the new line that Model was trying to build further west. The German army in the summer of 1944 was hemorrhaging strength in 100 directions simultaneously, and each individual hemorrhage, each local crisis, each desperate relief attempt, each rear guard action was tactically rational and strategically ruinous. Vilno today is Vilnius, the capital of an independent Lithuania, a member of the European Union and NATO. The contested city of 1944, claimed by Poles, Lithuanians, and Soviets, is no longer contested in the same way, though the historical memory of who fought for it and who was betrayed there remains a live and sensitive subject in Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian historiography. The AK fighters who were disarmed by the NKVD in July 1944 are remembered differently depending on which country's textbooks you open. In Poland, they are heroes betrayed. In Soviet-era Russian accounts, they are barely mentioned. The silence, as always, is its own form of evidence. Chapter 16. The Edge of the Abyss. Warsaw and Culmination. Late July, 1944. The leading elements of Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front have reached the eastern bank of the Vistula River and the outskirts of Praga, the eastern suburb of Warsaw, separated from the city proper by the river. The offensive that began on the 22nd of June, 600 kilometers to the east, has arrived at the gates of the Polish capital. And here, after 5 weeks of continuous advance, it stops. The reasons for the stop are the most contested question in the entire Bagration historiography, and I am not going to pretend that I can resolve them. What I can do is present the evidence for both sides and explain why the question matters so much that people are still arguing about it 82 years later. On the 1st of August, 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising, the largest single act of resistance in occupied Europe during the entire war. The AK Command, having watched the Soviet advance sweep across Belarusia and into eastern Poland, calculated that the Red Army would reach Warsaw within days, and that a Polish uprising would both accelerate the city's liberation and establish the Home Army as the legitimate authority in the capital. The calculation was plausible. It was also wrong. The Red Army did not cross the Vistula. The uprising would last 63 days. The Germans would suppress it with systematic brutality. The Soviets would watch from the other side of the river. The Soviet explanation for the halt was logistical. The First Belarusian Front had advanced 600 kilometers in 5 weeks, double the distance that standard Soviet logistical doctrine considered sustainable without a major operational pause. The Second Tank Army, which had been driving toward Warsaw, had suffered significant losses, both in combat and from mechanical attrition during the long advance. The T-34's transmission was notoriously fragile on extended road marches, and tank strength was well below establishment levels. A German counterattack at Radzymin on the eastern approaches to Warsaw had pushed back Soviet forward elements in late July, demonstrating that the front still had fight in it. Supply lines were stretched thin. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles were in short supply. The logistical argument for the halt was genuine and supported by the operational data. The political explanation is also supported by evidence, though of a different kind. Stalin had every reason to want the Warsaw Uprising to fail. The AK was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, which Stalin intended to replace with a Soviet-backed government. An AK-led liberation of Warsaw would have dramatically strengthened the London Poles' political position at a moment when Stalin was working to marginalize them. The precedent at Vilno, where AK fighters had been disarmed and arrested within days of the city's liberation, demonstrated that Soviet policy toward the Home Army was already one of suppression. The absence of any serious Soviet attempt to assist the uprising, even by airdrop, which would have been logistically feasible even if a full-scale river crossing was not, suggests that the halt was, at minimum, politically convenient. Rokossovsky's position in all of this is uniquely painful, and it is his perspective that I have chosen for this chapter, because the biographical details make the operational questions inescapable. Rokossovsky was born in Warsaw. He was ethnically Polish. He had been arrested during Stalin's purges in 1937, imprisoned for 3 years, and subjected to interrogations during which, according to multiple accounts, his teeth were broken. He was released in 1940 and returned to military service, serving the man who had ordered his imprisonment with a professionalism that must have required a form of psychological compartmentalization that I cannot fully imagine. In late July and August 1944, he stood on the eastern bank of the Vistula, in command of the front facing his birth city, and did not cross. Whether he could not or would not, whether the distinction even applied to a man serving the dictator who had tortured him, is a question that does not have a military answer. Rokossovsky's wartime diary, portions of which have been published while others remain in restricted archives, contains entries from late July describing logistical difficulties and the need to regroup. These entries are plausible and consistent with the operational situation. What the diary does not mention, in a document otherwise attentive to operational detail, is the Warsaw Uprising. The omission is notable. Rokossovski, a meticulous recorder of operational events, simply does not address the largest military event taking place directly across the river from his headquarters. The silence reads not as an oversight, but as a decision about what was safe to commit to paper in a diary that might one day be read by the wrong eyes. The question of whether the halt at Warsaw was primarily logistical or primarily political has been debated for over 8 decades, and I need to be honest about the limits of what the evidence can tell us. The logistical constraints were real. The political motivations were real. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible, I would say probable, that the Soviet forces genuinely needed an operational pause after 600 kilometers of advance, and that Stalin was simultaneously content to let the pause serve his political objectives by allowing the Germans to destroy the AK. The historian who claims this question is simple, in either direction, is not being honest with the evidence or with you. I cannot resolve it. I don't think it can be resolved. What I can say is that the uprising lasted 63 days. The Soviets did not cross the river, and approximately 200,000 Polish civilians died. The end of the Warsaw Uprising in early October 1944 effectively marked the end of the strategic consequences of Bagration. Though the offensive itself had formally concluded on the 19th of August, when Soviet forces shifted to a general defensive posture across the newly established front line. The front that Model had begun building in early July, reinforced by the natural break of logistical exhaustion, had solidified into something stable enough that the war's next phase would require an entirely new offensive, the Vistula-Oder operation of January 1945. Bagration was over. Army Group Center was destroyed. The front had moved 600 kilometers westward. The political architecture of post-war Eastern Europe had been established in fact, if not yet in treaty. The Vistula River still flows through Warsaw. The city was rebuilt painstakingly from rubble. First the medieval Old Town, then the modern districts, then the bridges that the Germans destroyed during the suppression of the uprising. Rokossovski's observation point on the eastern bank is not marked. The debate about his role, about whether he was unable or unwilling to cross, about whether the distinction mattered, about whether a Polish-born Soviet marshal, watching his birth city burn, was a victim or a participant, continues in Polish, Russian, and Western historiography without resolution. The silence in Rokossovski's diary remains the most eloquent document in the entire Bagration archive. Not for what it says, for what it doesn't. Chapter 17. The Audit. Counting the Dead, Counting the Cost. The 19th of August, 1944. Across a front line stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathians, Soviet forces shift to a general defensive posture. Operation Bagration is officially over. The offensive that began on the 22nd of June has run for 58 days. The front has advanced approximately 600 kilometers. Army Group Center, which began the operation with 38 divisions, has lost 28 of them, destroyed outright or rendered combat ineffective. The German casualty returns filed with the OKH Personnel Office list the official figures. 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, 263,000 captured or missing. The numbers are precise. They are also incomplete. The missing category, in the context of the Eastern Front in 1944, was overwhelmingly a euphemism for dead. Modern demographic research has revised the total German casualty figure significantly upward from the official OKH numbers. Current estimates range from approximately 400,000 to as high as 540,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The discrepancy between the official figure and the revised estimates stems from the treatment of entire units that disappeared without filing final strength reports. Formations that were overrun so quickly or so completely that no one survived to document their destruction. The gap between these numbers is not a minor statistical adjustment. It is the difference between a catastrophic defeat and an annihilation. Tens of thousands of men exist in that gap. Men who were neither officially killed nor officially captured, but who simply vanished from the records, absorbed into the forests and swamps of Belorussia without a trace that any filing system could capture. The Soviet losses were staggering by any standard, and they complicate any narrative that frames Bagration purely as a triumph. Soviet casualties totaled approximately 765,000, 178,000 killed, missing, or captured, and 587,000 wounded. These are enormous numbers for a victorious army. They exceed the total casualties of many Soviet defeats earlier in the war. The Red Army that destroyed Army Group Center paid for the destruction with a river of its own blood. And the willingness to accept that cost, the institutional and political capacity to sustain an offensive that consumed 750,000 men in under 2 months, tells you something about the Soviet system that the military narrative alone cannot convey. A comparative analysis between Bagration and Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, and the subsequent campaign in France, which overlapped almost precisely in time, reveals a disparity that the Anglophone world has never fully absorbed. Frontage. Bagration, approximately 1,000 kilometers. Overlord, approximately 100. German divisions destroyed. Bagration, 28. Overlord through the end of August, approximately 7 to 10. German casualties. Bagration, 300,000 to 540,000. Overlord through August, approximately 240,000. Depth of advance. Bagration, 600 kilometers. Overlord, approximately 300. By every measurable metric, Bagration was the larger operation. It receives, in English-language popular history, perhaps 1/10 the attention. The reasons for this disparity are many. Language barriers, Cold War politics, the Anglophone world's natural focus on its own operations. But the disparity itself is a fact that any honest accounting must acknowledge. The territorial results of Bagration were immense and irreversible. All of Belorussia was liberated. Significant portions of the Baltic states were recaptured. Eastern Poland was occupied. The pre-war western border of the Soviet Union was restored and, in many sectors, crossed. East Prussia, German sovereign territory, was within striking distance. The front line that had stood deep inside the Soviet Union since 1941 was now pressing against the borders of the Reich itself. The strategic map of Europe had been redrawn in 58 days, and the redrawing was permanent. Nothing the German army did in the remaining 9 months of the war would reverse it. The political consequences were equally irreversible and equally deliberate. Soviet control over the liberated territories was established immediately through NKVD internal security forces and Soviet-aligned political structures. The Polish government in exile in London was marginalized. The Home Army was being systematically disarmed and suppressed. The Lublin Committee, a Soviet-backed rival to the London Poles, was installed as the provisional government of liberated Poland. The political architecture of what would become the Eastern Bloc was not imposed at Yalta or Potsdam. It was imposed on the ground, in the wake of Bagration's advance, by troops and administrators who followed the tank armies westward. The military operation and the political operation were not sequential. They were simultaneous. When I began this project, I assumed that Bagration was overlooked in the English-speaking world because the Eastern Front is less accessible to Anglophone historians. Fewer translated sources, less familiar geography, a narrative tradition that privileges the Western Allied experience. I no longer believe that explanation is sufficient. I think Bagration is overlooked because the story it tells is too complicated for the narratives we prefer. It is a story of Soviet military mastery that simultaneously depends on American trucks. It is a story of liberation that is simultaneously a story of political conquest. It is a story of courage and sacrifice on both sides that produced casualties so enormous they resist emotional comprehension. It doesn't fit neatly into anyone's preferred framework, not the Western narrative of D-Day as the war's turning point, Not the Soviet narrative of inevitable socialist triumph, not the German narrative of noble defeat against impossible odds. It is messy, morally tangled, and vast. Perhaps that's why it has been easier to forget. 3 German generals from this story illuminate the war's aftermath in ways that the operational narrative cannot. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who stabilized the front after Bagration, took his own life in April 1945 rather than surrender in the Ruhr pocket. General Vincenz Müller, who surrendered the Fourth Army at Minsk, became a general in East Germany's National People's Army and took his own life in 1961. General Friedrich Gollwitzer, captured at Vitebsk, spent more than a decade in Soviet captivity before returning to West Germany in the mid-1950s. 3 men, 3 fates, each one shaped by a decision made in the forests of Belarusia in the summer of 1944. The military operation ended on the 19th of August. Its consequences did not. The forests of Belarusia have regrown. The corduroy roads have rotted. The Feste Plätze have been rebuilt into functioning cities. The rail lines that the partisans cut have been repaired, upgraded, and repaired again. The roads from Orsha to Borisov carry civilian traffic. The Berezina flows under modern bridges. Minsk is a city of nearly 2 million people, and there is nothing in its skyline to tell you that 100,000 men were once trapped in the forest to its east. The physical landscape has healed, but the archives remain open, and the questions they contain about intelligence failures and doctrinal obstinacy, about logistical miracles and political betrayals, about what it cost to destroy an army and what it means to liberate a country that didn't ask to be liberated by you. Those questions have not healed. They are still open. They will remain open. The German casualty returns for Army Group Center, filed neatly in the archives, end with the official totals. 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, 263,000 missing. The columns are aligned. The arithmetic is tidy. And the word missing, repeated 263,000 times, once for each man who vanished from the paperwork of the German army between June and August of 1944, sits at the bottom of the page like a door that was never closed.